Chapter 852. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain of this flight. After careful evaluation, I am sorry to inform you that this flight will be turning around and returning. Yukawa Aisuke was sitting sideways on his seat, with most of his legs stuck in the aisle. His body was slack and he was still trying to digest the changes that had happened before and after he fainted. He was not in a good state. The after effects of forcefully attaching his soul had yet to subside. His skull was buzzing, and occasionally there was a sharp tinnitus. Under such circumstances, he automatically filtered out most of the broadcast information of the flight, leaving only the most important word, return. His eyeballs moved, and he glanced sideways from the corner of his eye. The key factor that caused all this was right in front of him. Less than 3 meters away, the puppet controlled by the Pope, like Yukawa Aisuke, was sitting sideways on his seat, facing the aisle, with his elbows on his knees and his body slightly leaning forward. This posture had not changed for a long time. But compared to the moment when Yukawa Aisuke opened his eyes, this puppet that looked like a business elite seemed to have been sucked dry of blood and water. All that was left was a skinny silhouette, like a mummy. There was almost no breath coming in and out of its mouth and nose. With such damage to its body, it was already a miracle that it could maintain the most basic vitality. It would be difficult to do anything more than that. But to the Pope, this was not a problem at all. The Pope's consciousness was still here, calmly calculating and living within his means to maintain the puppet's breath. At the same time, everyone in the first-class cabin still had to rely on him to survive. It was precisely because this breath was too weak that everyone in the spacious cabin held their breaths. In most cases, they were like wooden statues. Yukawa Aisuke was the same. No one restrained him, but in this kind of atmosphere, the only things he could use were his eyes and thoughts. In the beginning, he only looked at his surroundings dizzily, passively accepting the drastic changes that happened after the nightmare. As time passed, his mushy brain began to slowly recover, although this kind of recovery first brought about a sense of pain. Yukawa Aisuke saw the virtual workspace in front of the Pope's puppet, saw the mimicry of the spiritual sea, and saw the continuous appearance of chaotic ripples. Of course, he had heard and seen how the Pope taught by Xinyan how to operate the corresponding equipment. He almost didn't dare to think too deeply about the logic behind it. His mouth was full of bitterness. If possible, he hoped to delete all the orders and bargaining records related to the mimicry generator a few days ago, both in reality and in people's memories. However, this was only wishful thinking. The corner of Yukawa Aisuke's eye twitched a few times. The bottle of water in his hand suddenly turned into a red-hot soldering iron, sticking to the flesh of his palm. It was not easy to hold it, nor was it easy to throw it away. After a few seconds, Yukawa Aisuke finally made up his mind. He gritted his teeth and said, "Then go ask him." Bai Xinyan smiled. She gestured to Yukawa Aisuke to take a good look at the current state of the Pope's puppet. The latter's stiff, mummified appearance was the best reason. Yukawa Aisuke took a deep breath. Ha! It was strange. After the previous round of torment, the atmosphere that made people dare not even breathe had become lively. Although the Pope's consciousness was probably still watching everything coldly, or maybe he was silently keeping score, at least for now, he didn't have the intention to blame anyone, let alone the strength to do so. Ha! Whether it was a brilliant realization or a broken pot, Yukawa Aisuke's breathing had indeed become a lot livelier. The corner of his mouth twitched. He threw the bottle of water in his hand back to Bai Xinyan. "You came to this conclusion after observing for such a long time." Bai Xinyan caught it firmly. She unscrewed the cap and took a big gulp without any misgivings. She exhaled a long breath, looking like she was drinking fine wine. "I didn't need to observe to come to this conclusion. Since you made a move against him, did you not read Persona?" "Persona? Oh, I did." Yukawa Aisuke still had an impression of it. The target of this intelligence analysis, named Persona Mask, was Luo Nan. The information had been published more than half a year ago. At that time, Luo Nan was using the cage theory to sweep away the traditional soul theory of the inner world. It was quite popular for a time, but the analysis itself was a bit secretive. The follow-up was not followed up in time, so it slowly lost its popularity. The version in Yukawa Isuk's hands also included the comprehensive analysis of various sources by his family's intelligence personnel. The research was more comprehensive than the one on the market. But what did Bai Xinyan mean by mentioning it? Bai Xinyan took a big gulp of mineral water. Her eyes wandered as if she was tipsy. Ask. Answer. According to the logic of the persona mask, Professor Luo has three basic faces: rationality, strength, and weakness. Which face are we facing now? It's rationality. It wasn't Yukawa Isuk who answered. It was the Pope's puppet that let out a buzzing sound. Chapter 853. Yukawa Isuk confirmed that it was the papal puppet who spoke. The puppet's lips moved slightly as it made a sound. But other than that, there was no other change. The dim pupils were still pointing at the spiritual sea mimicry map. Your Majesty also watches Persona. On the other side, Bai Xinyan quickly changed the topic of conversation. Her reaction was lively and quick, a stark contrast from the honest operator a few minutes ago. In fact, ever since Bai Xinyan took the initiative to speak and handed over the bottle of water, her attitude had changed subtly. This made Yukawa Isuk wonder if he was just a prelude to the previous round of conversation. While he was suspicious, Yukawa Isuk was actually listening attentively to hear how the Pope would respond. But before he could do that, another wave of low vibrations entered the cabin. The intensity of the sound wave was average, but it just so happened to resonate with the structure of the airship. For a moment, the cabin windows and seats were buzzing, and the vibrations numbed everyone's limbs and lumbar spine. Obviously, it was not only the first-class cabin that was experiencing this. Yukawa Isuk could already hear the screams from the other cabins. To be honest, Yukawa Isuk was also a little panicked. At this moment, the papal puppet's whisper sounded again in the buzzing vibration. Shrink. Yukawa Isuk could no longer understand the professional jargon behind it. Bai Xinyan reacted quickly and started a new round of operation on the spiritual sea mimicry map. The scale of the spiritual sea mimicry map seemed to be increasing, showing more details. Of course, probably only the Pope and Bai Xinyan could understand it. What Yukawa Isuk saw was a simple electrocardiogram on the interface, sometimes on the left, sometimes on the right, moving up and down. But forgive his poor eyesight, even if the details in some areas had increased, there was no obvious change on the whole. Only a professional would be able to figure out the trick from this. It doesn't seem to be suitable. Bai Xinyan's voice sounded again, as if she was regretting it. But in the current situation, it sounded awkward no matter how one listened to it. The papal puppet did not make any obvious movements. Beneath its half-closed eyelids, it still vaguely gazed at the mimicry image of the spiritual sea. Just when everyone thought that this scene would continue, a low, mosquito-like voice rang out. What do you think? It's just not very suitable. The Pope puppet did not waste any more energy to speak, only glancing over with its gloomy and lightless eyes. His cold gaze got rid of the casual air that had just appeared in Bai Xinyan's body. She instinctively bowed, and the smile on her lips became much more restrained. Please forgive me, Your Highness. I didn't speak clearly. Actually, it was Your Highness who helped me to roughly understand the design of the mimicry image of the spiritual sea. That's how I came up with this idea. If there's anything I don't understand, I hope Your Highness can enlighten me. After talking for a while, Bai Xinyan went straight to the point. The parameters set up by Your Majesty are based on the airship tourists. It's the structure of the spiritual sea built by the airship tourists. This structure was more in line with the main background from last time in Ban City. The results that appeared were more comparable. But the problem was that His Majesty and the Lord True God had descended. Junior Luo Nan didn't dare to linger. He fled far away and only played around in the periphery. The structure built by the hundreds of passengers on the yacht was clearly insufficient in terms of coverage. Therefore, I boldly guessed that Your Highness should take the initiative to graft this layer of structure with the power projected by the Lord True God. He forcefully spread it out and expanded its coverage, allowing Luo Nan's methods to leave traces on it as much as possible. The Pope puppet did not have any obvious reaction to Bai Xinyan's narration. Next to her, Yukawa Aishuk listened very seriously. Of course, he didn't quite understand, but his imagination was pretty good. The scene of the Pope spreading out a thick pancake and sending it to the true God's hands to spin in circles or cast a net to catch fish appeared in his mind. That was probably what it meant. The Pope didn't object. That meant he acknowledged it. Wait a minute. Weren't Yukawa Aishuk and the others also passengers on the airship? In other words, they were also part of the ingredients for this pancake. Bai Xinyan seemed to have heard his thoughts as he let his imagination run wild. She tilted her head and smiled. Yes. The distance between us and Professor Luo is much closer than we imagined. It's like an oil slick on the surface of the water, or a fly sticker. Yukawa Aishuk's expression was a bit stiff. He turned to look at his head bodyguard. Kitano Sakuto stood upright like a wooden stake. Yukawa Aishuk could get his answer from this guy's reaction. The problem right now is that Luo Nan's methods are a bit unreasonable. It's beyond my expectations. The Pope puppet's cracked and bloodless lips opened and closed slightly. Its voice was weak and vague, but its meaning was clear. He can hide, and he can counterattack. The voice stopped for a few seconds. It seemed as if it was unwilling to mention it. It seemed as if it was pondering over its words. But in the end, it still determined Luo Nan's behavior. It's very pure. Bai Xinyan didn't seem to understand. She asked, "What do you mean by pure?" The papal puppet wanted to continue speaking, but what flowed from its mouth this time was dark red froth of blood. Bai Xinyan let out an "oh." She still spoke in a regretful tone. "This body has finally reached its limit. Your Majesty, is there any other way to persevere?" As soon as these words left her mouth, Bai Xinyan immediately received a dozen gazes from all around her. Especially the bodyguards who were trying their best to hide in the shadows. They looked like they were about to collapse. The problem was that their wills were never taken into consideration. That included Bai Xinyan. In the next second, an indescribable shadow filled the eyes of everyone in the first-class cabin. Yukawa Aishuk felt as if he had taken a step into the shade of the branches and leaves under the sun. To be more precise, he himself was part of the shade. He faced the blazing sun while weaving the shadows. Everyone in the first-class cabin was probably doing this. This shade was not meant for them to enjoy. The Pope puppet was completely motionless. Having used up its last drop of blood essence, it had completely turned into a dried corpse. Meanwhile, the Pope's will, which had borrowed the existence of its corpse, conveniently entered the tree's shade. Using an exquisite guiding power, it intersected the branches and leaves in all directions, ultimately forming a tree nest that was the structure of a spiritual vessel. A wonderful feedback came. Yukawa Aishuk suddenly realized that he had a bit of the ability to communicate in the mental realm. This ability was undoubtedly given to him by the Pope. It was also decided by his current state. In the end, the Pope switched to the mode of mental projection. This time, there was no one to act as a power bank. It was probably because the same method was not suitable for a third time. He could only settle for the next best thing, thus, everyone present, including Yukawa Aishuk, became the framework of the so-called tree nest. As for what the tree nest was, not many people understood. It was because it was a construct on the mental plane. According to Yukawa Aishuk's understanding, the Pope used the magnetic fields of their lives to build a temporary nest or safe haven. This provided the conditions for a weak consciousness to stay in space. No one knew the specifics of the situation. Only one thing was certain. The Pope's consciousness could directly appear in their minds, turning into images and sounds to achieve communication. This is a mental technique, but it is not used on the emotional level of Yukawa. Instead, it comes and goes, directly affecting the space-time structure. The Pope seamlessly continued his previous evaluation and analysis of Luonan. This was an explanation for purity. Yukawa Aishuk should not have understood this. But in this tree nest shadow state, he muddle-headedly understood a lot of conceptual knowledge. He also possessed the ability to make preliminary analysis. It was as if there was a built-in AI operating. Because it was purity, it broke away from the level of the Pope's design. Although it would still have an impact, this impact was no different from the impact of nature's wind, rain, thunder, and lightning. It was practically impossible to capture Luonan's special interference mode through the sea of consciousness mimicry. In other words, the Pope's plan was ruined. Yukawa Aishuk seemed to have split into two sides. One side had the normal thoughts of a mortal, and the other floated on the supernatural plane. He did not even have the time to fear before he was pushed forward by the surging pressure of information. He could only do his best to adapt to his current state. The Pope was still communicating with Bycinyan. It's still useful. At least we know the upper limit of Luonan's level. He's much stronger than expected. And we also know that Luonan's forte is not in making a fuss over people's emotions. Instead, he bypassed the path of controlling other people's fates and entered the domain of pure configuration design. Especially space-time configurations. It's still related to the situation in Band City. Without the restrictions of the material plane, the Pope was a lot more talkative. And it was the exquisiteness of his words that made Yukawa Aishuk think, I wonder how Luonan feels when he's being studied by an extraordinary. Amidst his thoughts, Yukawa Aishuk suddenly felt that the sunlight behind him had suddenly become extremely hot. At the same time, his fleshly body also captured a new wave of lightning and thunder. This made him understand, becoming a tree nest, embedding itself into the mental framework, meant that it was closer to the battlefield. In a trance, a part of Yukawa Aishuk's consciousness was thrown into the depths of the hazy void. He touched upon the ever-changing battlefield of the true God and Luonan. Even though his brain was now implanted with the AI, he was still unable to experience the exquisite details. He could only feel some vague, symbolic feelings. Luonan really did seem to be embedded in the depths of the void. It was like the hidden chain lock of a precision machine. When it twisted and turned, there would be some deformation inside. But on the outside, it was always in a stable and smooth state. It satisfied the psychological instinct of people to pursue order. Not only did it conform to people's psychology, but it also conformed to the laws and principles of the world. Chapter 854. Yukawa Aishuk watched with rapt attention. For him, the battlefield outside of the intercontinental airship was still flashing with blurry images. But after seeing it many times, a certain logic naturally formed. As time passed, his condition improved significantly. In his days, it was as if an invisible thread was pulling him to a higher place, allowing him to see more clearly and more thoroughly. Everything happened in the shadows. It was silent and undetectable. It was as if a god had blessed him. His train of thought became exceptionally clear. He was no longer constrained by the present situation. He made some expansions and extensions. He felt that a true god's method of pursuit was like a dragnet. Luonan was like a fish in the net. The dragnet itself was very large. There was a certain amount of space for movement. The mesh was not small either. There was a possibility of escape at any time. Now that the airship was forced to turn back, it was advantageous for the true God and the Pope. After all, the closer they were to Band City, the greater the control the true God had over the dragnet. They could shrink the mesh and give Luo Nan more pressure. Unexpectedly, you have the potential in this area. The Pope transmitted telepathically. The direction was very clear. It was directed at Yukawa Aishuk. Was he evaluating him? Yukawa Aishuk was startled and chilled. How did the Pope know what he was thinking? Well, it must be because of this damned tree nest. For an extraordinary like the Pope, it was not a big deal for him to use methods like mind reading. But this feeling was more or less the same as Luo Nan's invasion. Oh, there was still a difference. Luo Nan was a great thief. He suddenly came. It was unknown what path he took. By the time he came to his senses, he had already fallen into the trap. He was muddle-headed and tied up. The Pope, on the other hand, had an aura of open warfare. It was as if it was a matter of course. I came in and stayed. You do whatever you want. I just stared at you. The degree of perverseness was even off. Yukawa Aishuk cut off his thoughts. He did not dare to think too deeply about it. He forced himself to think about positive issues. For example, that evaluation. In the field of ability users, the Pope's words were more or less the same. Could it be that he really had talent in this area for this person to think highly of him? He had seen too much and thought too much. He was getting a bit carried away. Yukawa Aishuk subconsciously pondered. If he could get through this, perhaps he could focus on developing this aspect. While he was lost in his own thoughts, the Pope gave his evaluation, and then conversed with Baisinyan. He's very restrained. He spins at a low speed and glides in neutral. The Pope also used an analogy to describe Luo Nan's current state. It was easy for everyone to understand. Baisinyan said, perhaps he can only maintain such a low consumption state in the void interlayer, and also avoid direct interference with the true God's power. It's a reasonable judgment, but it's a little perfunctory. It's all thanks to your Majesty's wisdom that I was able to think of these things. However, we are just small fries. It's fine for a short period of time, but if we continue to act as the carrier of the tree nest, and bear the pressure of Swani's calculations, I'm afraid we'll soon be unable to do as we wish. So far so good. The Pope's reply was so cold that it made people's hearts sink. However, no one dared to contradict her. Baisinyan's actions were already extremely out of line. Yukawa Aishin's heart was stupefied. So that's how it is, but that's the only logical explanation. Who in this world was born with knowledge? Even if there was such a thing, it would most likely belong to the young man outside the airship who had dealings with the true God and the Pope. The pain came from the comparison. The clearer his heart was, the more bitter the comparison was. At this moment, Yukawa Aishin felt as if there was a poisonous spider crawling in his heart. Its limbs scratched the tip of his heart, and there was a web of silk entanglement. There were no external injuries, but he always felt as if poison was slowly seeping in. It was extremely stifling. But in this current state, he could not help it. Very quickly, his attention was drawn away by the miraculous changes in the hazy void. Even though Yukawa Aishin knew that this was only a temporary ability given to him by the Pope, he still enjoyed the process of being able to observe, analyze, and make judgments. After all, this was an extraordinary ability that he had always yearned for. Its level was high, its profoundness was profound, and it far exceeded his imagination. He greedily perceived the mysteries within the structure of space and time, especially from the perspective of the true God and the Pope. After he shared the Pope's burden and received the blessing, it became easier to cut in and understand. Well, he still seemed to understand, but he wasn't. Especially when his rationality was still a mess, but he always felt that there was a side of his heart that was crystal clear and crystal clear. I still have talent, it's just that I haven't developed it yet. Yukawa Aishin kept encouraging himself. As the head of a large family, he did not lack confidence. It was just that he was forced into a field that he was not good at, and it was inevitable that he would feel inferior. Now, this half-yin, half-yang, suddenly bright and suddenly dark state gave him a reason to convince himself. It also allowed his thoughts to maintain a good state on a logical level. He was thinking again, judging from the airship's return, and the Pope's constant switching of mental states, the two of them probably did not expect the current situation at the beginning. Chapter 855. The intercontinental airship had completed its turn. It was as if it had crashed into a cumulonimbus cloud. Plentiful water vapor and high-altitude astral winds intertwined, instantly blurring the portholes on both sides. Then, a nearly parallel waterline was drawn above the airship. In the dark environment, the cloud was like a demon. It danced outside the porthole and was cut into pieces by the waterline. Yukawa Aishuk looked at the changes in the environment between light and dark. He was suddenly inspired. In his daze, he forgot about the severe discomfort in his body. At this moment, he seemed to see the aftermath of the collision between Luo Nan and a true god in the void. The collision was so intense that even the sealed cabin seemed to be leaking. Yes, it was the feeling of water vapor blowing on one's face. Yukawa Aishuk saw Kitano Suzuto subconsciously wipe his face. Kitano Suzuto's back was facing the direction of the airship. The Pope communicated with Baisinyen in the shadow of the tree nest. This was his evaluation of the sudden phenomenon. Nothing solid. You've locked onto it. No. The progression is so beautiful. This was the first time in Yukawa Aishuk's memory that the Pope had an emotional sigh. For a while, there was no response from within the tree nest until the airship shook again. The second wave, the third wave. The shaking of the airship was closely related to the structural changes in the depths of the cloud. Due to the distribution of computational pressure, the relevant information flowed and circulated in the shadow of the tree nest, peeling off layer by layer. Of course, some people knew less and some people knew more. Yukawa Aishuk could see it relatively clearly. He knew that the water vapor cloud was the product of the collision between Luo Nan and the true god. Luo Nan used the condensation ring as the basic interference core. It was destined to rely on an abundant water vapor environment. The true god carried out a strong suppression. The collision of the two sides on the material plane caused the water vapor in the sky to condense and explode abnormally, creating this cloud phenomenon. Because of this, the cool feeling of the water vapor was able to penetrate the obstruction of the airship's outer shell and directly affect the people's bodies and minds. It's mixed with fragments from the collapse of the void. If the intensity is increased, this airship will be cut to pieces. But then it will be completely at the extraordinary level. Yukawa Aishuk's thought seemed to have left his identity as a passenger and jumped out of his own dimension. With incredible focus, he observed and evaluated the increasingly intense battle. Luo Nan and the true god were currently locked in front of the airship, in contrast to the aimless pursuit of Luo Nan. Because of this, the scale of the cumulonimbus cloud that the airship crashed into continued to expand. The airship's strategy was to increase its altitude in an attempt to avoid danger, but the effect was really suspicious. Dark clouds continued to surge in the surroundings. Between the layers of clouds, lightning and fire swam about, flickering and extinguishing. Some of them even struck straight at him. Although they were all blocked by the insulating armor on the outer layer, the thunderous roar still crushed in. Each strike was louder than the last, each strike stronger than the last. The cries and screams from the lower cabins never ceased. This stalemate was really absurd. According to Yukawa Aishuk's observations, the true god should have locked onto Luo Nan's relative position. It was relative to Luo Nan's current functional region within the spacetime structure. Right now, he was still bombarding Luo Nan's outer shell. He had yet to truly explore the core. Luo Nan was still hidden deep within the void, and the true God was constantly trying to squeeze him out from the spacetime structure. For this reason, Luo Nan adopted an unprecedented proactive attitude. He forcefully interfered with the plentiful water vapor of the material plane, forming some sort of defense system. He used the mutual interference between the mental and the material plane to continuously dissolve the true God's attacks. This was what the Pope meant by progressive levels. Thoughts that even he himself found hard to understand revolved wildly in Yukawa Isuke's mind. It was like a drill, drilling deeper and deeper, getting closer and closer to that mysterious and unfathomable level. But unwittingly, he drilled through the limits of his body. In the end, he collapsed. His vision went black, and his mind suddenly went blank. Yukawa Isuke's figure fell forward, falling out of his seat. Fortunately, Kitano Sweto reacted in time. He extended his arm to block, preventing Yukawa Isuke from hitting the ground. But at this moment, the shadow of the tree nest was affected by Yukawa Isuke's mental disruption. It lost an important support, and the structure of the mental plane suddenly shook. Yukawa Isuke fainted in time, so he wasn't affected. As for the others, whether it was by Sinyan, Kitano Sweto, or the group of bodyguards, they were all affected to varying degrees. For a moment, the sky was dark, and there was strong light and high temperature that penetrated the shadow barrier. It was much more refreshing than being exposed to the sun. Several people let out muffled groans. Most likely, they suffered damage on the mental plane. The Pope's telepathic thoughts paused for a moment, and then the structure of the tree nest returned to normal. But at this moment, the mummified puppet suddenly fell to the ground. Bai Xinyan, who was in front of him, didn't reach out. She watched as the corpse fell to the ground with a muffled thud. Bai Xinyan's eyebrows twitched. Correspondingly, he also had his own thoughts about the situation, but he was just suppressing them. Bai Xinyan did not care what he was thinking. She looked at the dark clouds in front of her. Just then, another lightning bolt struck down from the sky, illuminating the outline of the clouds that were like the precipice of an abyss. The incoming clouds were like beasts and demons that lived among them. They hit the outer shell of the airship and instantly shattered, then reassembled into other demonic shapes. After a second, Kitano Sweto, who was beside her, let out a low gasp. Over there. What affected his breathing was not the cloud phantom that was pouncing at him, but an area further away. Between the flowing and changing clouds, there was an obvious difference. How to put it, if the outer layer of scattered clouds was peeled off, the central area was obviously also made of clouds, but the outline was sharp, orderly, and full of artificial sturdiness. Another lightning bolt struck down, directly piercing through the outer layer of clouds and bombarding that area. In the eyes of Bai Xinyan and Kitano Sweto, faint ripples appeared in the void. The lightning bolt warped and curled around the periphery of that area until it dissipated. Some of the dissipated lightning eventually broke through, collapsing a corner of the cloud structure. But soon, lightning surged to fill the gap. It was still a square block, but it felt even more sturdy. It was simply a defensive fortification built by relying on the cloud mountain. Or perhaps it was a towering mountain pass in front of the airship. No matter how the outer layer of clouds changed, no matter how powerful the lightning bolt struck, that area continued to be fortified. It gave people the feeling that if the airship were to collide with it, it would most likely be smashed into smithereens. A fortress of the Ring of Blood will. Bai Xinyan glanced over. This one sentence proved that Kitano Sweto had done his homework on Luo Nan. Of course, this was due to the fact that this toy was famous. It only existed in the circle of ability users in Xia City. It was a marvelous configuration design that spread through all sorts of channels. If it were projected onto the plane of reality, it would probably look like this. Bai Xinyan did not object. She just muttered, "The ring of blood will fortress." The two of them spoke one after another, but before they could really communicate, a strong light suddenly burst out of the gloomy clouds. In the blink of an eye, it surpassed the level of lightning. The light was as dazzling as the sun, but it did not follow the trajectory of the sky at all. Instead, it fell straight towards the pass ahead. At this moment, the cumulonimbus clouds with abundant water vapor seemed to have been ignited. Chapter 856. Under the strong light, Sinyan and Kitano Sweto squinted their eyes. The cloudy void in front of them had turned into a giant steamer. Everything was blurred and distorted in the steam, including the pass in front of them. However, the pass area was somewhat out of place with the overall environment. It had a certain degree of resistance, so when the falling sun wheel smashed down, there was a slight deflection. Distortion against distortion. Time and space were stagnant for a while. The momentum of the impact slowed down, and the scene in front of them became more and more blurry. Illusion. Real world. Kitano Sweto was a typical physical type of person. As long as any supernatural situation did not really affect him, he would be suspicious. He still did not hear Sinyan's answer. As for the Pope, the moment Kitano Sweto's mind hooked with the madam, he suddenly felt dizzy. His feet seemed to have lost their support, and he felt a strong sense of falling. As a physical type of person, maintaining balance was a natural ability. Kitano Sweto subconsciously exerted strength in his waist and abdomen, but the feedback from his body told him that he was still standing there, very straight and stable. What was really out of balance and falling was his soul. A blinding light shone in. This time, it was hard to tell whether it was from the real world or the spiritual stimulation. It intertwined with the shadow structure of the tree nest, forming a sacrificial furnace that ignited all the soul power involved. At this moment, the tree nest structure extracted the soul power of Kitano Sweto and the others, and used it for other purposes. It was most likely to coordinate with the attack of the falling sun wheel. This was not surprising at all. Kitano Sweto was not a fledgling. The Pope used the tree nest to include all of them in the spiritual structure, so there must be a deeper consideration. Compared to the usual actions of the Amaterasu cult, what they did today was considered a relatively peaceful one. After all, he was a level B physical type. Although his soul power was not his forte, his foundation was solid, and he was full of vitality. This wave of absorption would not cause serious damage. At the moment, he was only short of breath and dizzy, but his mind was still clear. While he was checking his own condition, the violet vibration transmitted from the void in front of him ran over the tempered glass of the viewing platform and pressed on his chest. The vibration was transmitted from his chest to his brain, so much so that his lips and teeth were numb. He instinctively raised his head, but his vision was dark. It had nothing to do with the blood supply to the head. Instead, in the distant burning cloud, the falling sun happened to have an extremely obvious contraction, and its light was clearly dimming. As the light and darkness changed, the distortion of the void increased dramatically. The dark night had been torn to pieces and there was almost no trace of it. He saw that under the bombardment of the sun wheel, most of the structure of the pass built next to the clouds had evaporated. There was a large hole in the center with a radius of at least 1 kilometer. In this void environment, the thick clouds that were like towering mountains had become irregular piles that connected the front and the back. Even the other areas that didn't bear the impact of the sun wheel were already riddled with holes. It seemed that if there was another strong wind, it would vanish into thin air. The intercontinental airship moved forward under the bright light. There was almost no cumulonimbus around it. It was like a normal flight. This is really, Hoshino Satoto was confused. Everything that had just happened was beyond his cognitive limit. The self-protection mechanism was still working. All he knew was that the situation had suddenly been pushed to the most intense level. In the blink of an eye, there were only ruins left. At this time, he saw Bai Xinyan, who was still standing in front of him. The most intense scene had passed. Everyone was finally able to focus on something that they had neglected before. This mysterious woman stood perfectly straight from the waist down, but her upper body was leaning forward. She stretched out her arms against the tempered glass wall. Her body trembled as she breathed. It was clear that the other side wasn't having a good time either. Hoshino Satoto opened his mouth, wanting to ask a few questions, but the smell of fresh blood rushed up his throat. His mouth and nose were already wet. The relatively weak capillary network had nearly burst clean. He choked and coughed. Blood sprayed everywhere. He was in a sorry state. Bai Xinyan must have heard the cough. She exerted some strength in her arms and turned around to look. Her expression was calm, but her face was pale to the point of being transparent. Hoshino Satoto coughed out the blood clot in his throat with great difficulty. He asked in a hoarse voice, "Is he dead?" He was obviously referring to Ronan. Bai Xinyan curled her lips. "I'm not sure, he isn't." The Pope's telepathic thoughts had been absent for a long time. They reappeared and reverberated within the tree nest. But his words confirmed that the structure of the mental plane had already lost its stability. The telepathic transmission was illusory and illusory. There seemed to be a dark flame burning in the corner, creating disturbances from time to time. The Pope, however, had no intention of mending the situation. He described in detail what was happening at the moment in a rare instance. "We have broken the framework that he had erected, and broken the rules that he had forcefully inserted, but there is still a certain distance between us and his existence." Distance? Maybe it's only a centimeter. Maybe it's 1,000 kilometers. Maybe it's in another space and time. You mean, there is no point in delving into this? Look, the fortification is being restored. In fact, we are shuttling through its huge and precise construction site. Every water molecule we have come into contact with could be the building material for the next construction. Even though Hoshino Satoto's spirit was extremely dispirited, he still subconsciously turned his gaze to look through the viewing platform. He looked at the gradually darkening sky and the scattered clouds. In fact, he couldn't see anything special about it. It was probably because of his first impression. He felt that the flying cotton-like objects around the airship were suffused with a faint spiritual light. There were faintly discernible trajectories that interweaved to form the outline of a grand building. At this time, Bai Xinyan asked, "What do we do next?" "We don't do anything. That attack just now practically mobilized all the power that can be mobilized at this distance. Since we weren't able to make the final decision, we won't be able to do anything to him for a while." Bai Xinyan and Hoshino Satoto didn't know how to respond. If the Pope's words were to spread, Luo Nan's evaluation in the inner world would probably soar by several levels. Oh, it seemed like there was no one who could rise by several levels. After a few seconds, Bai Xinyan said, "Your Majesty exerted force just to reach this conclusion." It sounded like sarcasm at first, but in reality, it was very formal. The Pope's response was very calm. "I just feel that there is no need to hold an educational competition. Young people are so pure. They are researching this battle on the spot. They have probably forgotten their original goal. Do they want to be high profile? Or do they want to be low-key? Ha! What's important is that Qianju has been led into a rhythm by him. She has forgotten today's goal. Fortunately, I still remember. Your Majesty's goal is to find that interferer of Ban City. You suspect that it is Luo Nan." Bai Xinyan's telepathic thoughts suddenly became straightforward. The Pope took advantage of the situation to continue. "Look, the situation has become clear. Today, we have at least verified that he has this ability. Don't say doubt. That will only make people more confused." Confused? His ability exceeds expectations, but his critical performance deviates. He can't see through the inside. Of course he will be confused. Oh, so he encountered a confusing choice when doing a multiple-choice question. The Pope's telepathic thoughts seemed to be laughing. Child, reality has never been a question. Only a young man with a straight and narrow eye would need to be matched one by one, to be flawless. Right now, I just need to know that he is a fellow that needs to be taken seriously. The telepathic thoughts continued, but the structure of the tree nest could no longer support itself. It suddenly collapsed and turned into nothingness. Chapter 857. The tree nest on the spiritual plane collapsed, and the participants who were passively trapped in it returned to the real world. The natural curtain of night descended once again, like a thick blanket, blocking the field of vision, giving people a sense of self-deception and peace of mind. The Pope, who was in charge of the situation, left. The observation deck remained silent. Kitano Sukido and Baisinyan had their own thoughts, until the swarm of signals and communication devices connected, filling the space with ringing and vibrations. Kitano Sukido coughed again and raised his wrist. There was a list of communication requests from the Tamagawa family and their surrounding social circles. However, in the past half an hour, the first-class cabin had been an isolated island of information. There was almost no communication going in or out. On the other hand, the other areas of the airship maintained contact with the outside world. So this was not a signal interruption, but it was 100 times more terrifying. Because this was due to some kind of tacit understanding, and also due to some kind of silent majesty. The source was naturally the Amaterasu cult. There was no more obvious fact than this. The Amaterasu cult was the master of Osaka City, the undisputed ruler of traditional political and military forces like the Tamagawa family. Looking at the source, it was only 20 to 30 years ago. At Kitano Sukido's age, he had witnessed the entire process of the rise of the Amaterasu cult. This was the power and effect of a transcendent. If that was the case, the other side should be very fast. Kitano Sukido suddenly shivered. After stirring up a scene that was almost out of control, the Pope patted his butt and left. The true God probably wouldn't stay either, but the other side of the conflict was clearly still here. At this time, the intercontinental airship had completely passed through the ruins of the cumulonimbus cloud cluster. It was said that the cloud pass was still being rebuilt, and it had been completely left behind. But what was the point of such a small distance for a transcendent of that level? Thinking of this, Kitano Sukido did not have the mood to respond to the swarm of communication requests. His muscles tensed up, and he struggled to stand up from the ground. He wanted to respond effectively, but he was at a loss. Don't worry, under the mask of rationality, Professor Luo is not the kind of person to vent his anger on others. Speaking of which, we are also victims. Although he agreed with this self-assessment, was it really okay to say it so bluntly? Baisinyan's breathless voice didn't comfort him at all. Instead, it made him feel even more uneasy. Right now, he even felt that there was a piercingly cold will being injected into every single water molecule around him. It seemed that the next step would be to penetrate into his flesh and bones, see through everything, and sketch out life and death. Professor Luo could definitely do it. Subconsciously, Kitano Sukido put a hand on his chest, hoping to stabilize his abnormal heartbeat. At the same time, a faint light appeared before his eyes. It was Baisinyan opening the virtual workspace. What was shown in the work area was work. TSK, such a thing has just happened, and yet, you're forcing me to sign it without any consolation. How cold-blooded and foolish. It turns out that I'm surrounded by a nest of giant lizards with only their cruel nature left. What? Actually, Kitano Sukido wasn't sure if Baisinyan was talking to him, but it felt better to chat at this time. While Baisinyan was operating in the virtual workspace, she refuted, "It's already like this, and you still want to stir up trouble in Osaka." "Of course, I refuse." Kitano Sukido opened his mouth. He felt like he was watching a stage play. Bai Xinyan's expression and actions were on point, but there was a strong sense of deliberate intent, as if she was purposely putting on a show for someone to see. It was really a satirical play that made people unable to laugh. At this time, Bai Xinyan had finished her work. She turned around and kindly continued to comfort him. "Mr. Kitano, it's almost over. Look at the two of us. One is a bodyguard, and the other is a kept woman. We both have masters to serve, and from time to time, we have to expand our service scope. Our lives are already so hard, why do we have to think about things outside of our duties? What if King Sugar Daddy?" Finally, Kitano Tsukito remembered that this was an analogy that Bai Xinyan had used when she was talking to Yukawa Aishuk. In fact, it was still an analogy. Yes, we just have to be loyal to our duties. Kitano Tsukito bowed to Bai Xinyan, and his gaze landed on the first-class cabin behind the observation deck. Right now, the first-class cabin was a mess. A group of bodyguards had survived the disaster, but their soul power had just evaporated. Each of them looked like they were in a daze. Yukawa Aishuk was still lying in the aisle, and the almost forgotten Shanbei Xia Hui was still there. This was a situation that required a lot of effort to clean up. Then again, compared to other related situations, this might be the easiest to clean up. Kitano Tsukito began to busy himself with the aftermath. During this time, communication requests from the outside world continued to come in. These requests came from all sorts of directions, but their focus areas were highly overlapping. Thus, a series of high-frequency words were formed. The Amaterasu Order, the Pope, the True God. These words were definitely inescapable, but they would always add some evasive modifiers. In comparison, another word was much more direct. Luonan, 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 buzz buzz buzz. It's weird. Luonan floated under the water of Beishan Lake. A strand of his consciousness was anchored in the clouds 1,000 kilometers away. Doing two things at once was no big deal for him, but there was still some pressure when it came to analyzing and designing the spacetime configuration. He needed to be more focused. At least half of Luonan's mind was still focused on the moment when the sunwheel descended and bombarded the pass in the clouds. He watched as the sunwheel jumped out of nothingness, crushed the obstruction of the spacetime structure, and smashed down on his head. It was just like in a war game, when an exploding fireball was about to hit the player, and then the game was over. Strictly speaking, the game had already been reread once. Luonan's game character, the spacetime bubble he controlled, had already collapsed. It was like this for a moment. The key to the impact of the falling sunwheel was not the impact. The fatal killing move originated from the instantaneous explosive distortion of the surrounding void environment. The spacetime structure was illusory yet thick, empty yet tenacious. But it could still deform in the end, especially when the power of an extraordinary detonated the turbulent tsunami of the abyssal region. Then it interfered with the material plane and focused on the instantaneous explosion. The powerful distortion had already touched upon the plane of laws. It squeezed out all the redundancy in the spacetime structure. Luonan couldn't even muster the thought of resisting. He could determine that if he forcefully digested the instantaneous explosive power, the spacetime bubble would certainly not be able to withstand it. The pressure would inevitably return to his body. The sandwich domain was fine, but the exoskeleton frame was already damaged. It would most likely not be able to withstand the pressure. So Luonan let it happen. The spacetime bubble collapsed, but the net's core, which had been pouring into the void, was still preserved. Luonan quickly reconstructed on this foundation. There was a gap of about 2 seconds between the collapse and the reappearance. It was short, but for the true God and the Pope, 2 seconds was enough to explain the most crucial problem. The spacetime bubble was highly suspicious in its nothingness. I made a mistake. Luonan admitted that he had avoided direct damage in that instantaneous collision, but he had also lost his strategic target. He had allowed the true God and the Pope to see part of his bottom line, which would inevitably cause him to be passive. But who would have thought that the true God and the Pope, two extraordinaries, would actually join hands to deal with a junior like him? That's right. The attack of the solar will descending had the true God providing the output and the Pope controlling it. The two extraordinaries had synchronously controlled the propping mulberry tree's great divine treasure system, giving Luo Nan a head-on blow. This blow had shattered Luo Nan's disguise. It had also forced him to reveal the level of his ability. It had made him expose, or at least partially expose, his strategic intent. The following problems would certainly be very thorny. But then again, the true God and the Pope had exposed a lot of information in that moment. Especially the Pope's tree nest structure. It used Yukawa Aishuk and the others as fulcrum and fuel. Admittedly, it saved quite a bit of strength, making it possible to strike a thunderous blow from over 1,000 kilometers away. But at the same time, he had also given Luo Nan a chance. This allowed the altar's spiderweb, which had been laid out earlier to probe into the human heart, to seep in. Similarly, Yukawa Aishuk and the others acted as fulcrum, as well as a medium and channel. The subjective perspectives and operations of the true God and the Pope during the pursuit and the solar will descending attack were transmitted back one after another. This was an exquisite operation built upon the level and train of thought of extraordinaries. It was built upon the foundation of the propping mulberry tree's great divine treasure system. Even if Luo Nan had been in the game, he would not have been able to experience this level of detail by relying solely on Yukawa Aishuk and Kitano Suzuto. However, Luo Nan had borrowed the altar's spiderweb to integrate various perspectives. He had cleverly increased the precision and sensitivity of these detectors. He had discarded the blurred, distorted, and exaggerated impressions, forming a stream of information that was like a high-definition video. He could even play it frame by frame and study it over and over again. There was no more beautiful replay than this. Also, Luo Nan felt that he needed to reevaluate the effects of the daydream nightmare incident. It was precisely this early investment that allowed the breadth and depth of the altar's spiderweb to grow explosively. If it weren't for the need of today's actual combat, Luo Nan would not have known that 99% of the passengers on the intercontinental airship had already been pulled into their homes by the spiderweb. It was just a matter of how deep the spiderweb was. Just how many of them would be needed in the entire world to analyze the situation on the airship. As the spiderweb was spread out, the Wraith sign clearly became more and more accustomed to this world. In the past, the human-faced arachnid was fine when it was in the abyss region of the polar domain. But once it sunk into the material plane and probed into the sea of consciousness, it was absolutely impossible to hide from extraordinaries. Some keen psychic ability users were able to sense it. But now, the altar's spiderweb was universally connected. It had practically become a part of the hearts of the entire world. Its concealment ability had become inconceivable. Who didn't have a dark corner where the web had gathered dust? It was just a bit noisy. Chapter 858. By Sinyan, you scheming B*TCH. You've gone too far. The long-awaited instructions came back, and Captain Jimmy's mentality completely collapsed. He roared as he kicked the chair in front of him, and his arm almost hit the nose of the SCA's Minister de Yuen. His entire body had turned into a terrifying storm. It was the team's deputy, Monroe, who was sweating profusely as he tried his best to calm him down. "Boss, calm down. Calm down." Captain Jimmy continued to roar back, "Calm down $*T. $*T process. Every step in here is a piece of garbage pasted with $*T. Then what about you, the initiator?" That sentence could not be said no matter what. Monroe could only stretch out his arms and make a pressing motion, using all his expression and body language to persuade his boss, who was on the verge of losing his mind. "This is a critical time, Jimmy. Think about the airship over 1,000 kilometers away, think about that state. That state of being raised by AB*TCH. That Blackheart salt is doing this on purpose. This is a shady deal between her and the Blood Flame Order. She's seizing every opportunity possible. Being stared at by Captain Jimmy's charcoal-like eyes, Monroe's mind was momentarily taken away. Aside from being overwhelmed by his aura, he also felt the great suppression of the 7th-generation dynamo core. His mouth opened and closed twice, but he couldn't finish his sentence in time. Great, if she wants to disgust us with the process, I'll accompany her to the end. It's just another round of dog**T. I'll report the new discovery to the East Asia Department. Are you deaf? Memory loss. You didn't even record the large piece of intelligence analysis just now. If you want me to collect your salary on your behalf, I'll break your spine as a thank you gift. Captain Jimmy's roar could practically tear open the roof of the warehouse. The poor intelligence officer was suddenly targeted. He didn't even dare to raise his head as he began to work with a sullen face. The intelligence officer's memory was actually far better than that of an ordinary person, and his writing skills were also pretty good. He quickly converted Captain Jimmy's forcefully twisted logical analysis into a rigorous and meticulous document form. Seeing the content of his imagination quickly materialize into words, Captain Jimmy finally grinned. He already couldn't wait to sign and send it over. He didn't expect this kind of one-sided statement to be able to move the bureaucrats of the East Asia Department, as long as it could have the effect of disgusting Baisinyan. Captain Jimmy's expression suddenly changed. BZZT BZZT BZZT. The sudden vibration signal affected all the members of the operation team in the warehouse. There was almost no delay. At this moment, the dynamo core determined that the main body was in peaceful mode, and immediately displayed the received information on their retinas. Captain Jimmy choked again. If it was a requirement for actual combat, it would be at least 10%, which was probably the standard of the previous version of formatted space. Their operation team's record was 47%. As for the laboratory environment, the highest record was a heaven-defying 70%, which was said to be able to kill even extraordinaries. Frankly speaking, up until now, Captain Jimmy wasn't particularly proficient in this kind of combat style. The laboratory, on the other hand, was thinking of all kinds of ways and opportunities to deepen the impression of this batch of experimental subjects. Reality information loading. Countdown to login. 3, 2, 1. The archetype format symbol that represented the transfer to virtual reality appeared and instantly enlarged. When the tetrahedron, inscribed, and circumscribed spheres expanded to the limit of vision, the emptiness of the central region opened up. The astral winds and clouds in the sky wrapped in the boundless dark curtain of night and rushed towards them. This might be a real scene, or it might be a completely virtual product. Captain Jimmy habitually moved his limbs, but the low interference rate and emptiness made this movement meaningless. He gave up on the warm-up and turned to look around. His operation team had finished assembling and was now in this airspace. In other directions, figures appeared one after another. Most of them were familiar faces. They were all burners who carried the Apocalypse experimental 7th-generation dynamo core. Director Yen is over there. Captain Jimmy quickly saw that their true leader, Yen Yongbua, who was known as the pioneer among burners, was not far to the side. He was a gloomy and paranoid guy. More importantly, his authority over the dynamo core was one level higher than most of the people here. Whether it was public or private, Captain Jimmy had to go and greet him. Hold on. Men stopped him for a moment, indicating for Captain Jimmy to observe Yen Yongbua's expression. I'm afraid he's not in a good mood. Oh, virtual reality allowed everyone's external appearance and expression to obtain a high degree of restoration. It could be seen that Yen Yongbua's bad mood was already visible on his face. His face was ashen, clearly indicating that others should stay away. Captain Jimmy was also in a state of violent rage a few minutes ago, but when he saw Yan Yongbu's expression, he suddenly felt that it was better to calm down a bit. Discussing their superiors was everyone's common hobby. Jimmy and Mend were no exception. I remember that he was in a good mood a few days ago. He was waiting to watch a good show. It's an auction. He's waiting for Professor Luo to make a fool of himself. TSK. The two of them understood. It was at this time that a clear graphic presentation appeared in the night of virtual reality. It went straight to the point, informing everyone of the topic of this conference, nature of the conference, tactical seminar. Objective of the conference: conduct an analysis and research on atypical extraordinaries and formulate a targeted tactical plan. Case reference: Intercontinental Airship Attack and Defense Battle. Keywords: Luo Nan, True God, Pope of 100 Collections. Configuration: the night sky slightly rippled, and in the next second, an airship appeared in the clouds below. The airship indicator light attracted the gazes of most of the participants. Buzzing sounds of discussion arose. Since this was a tactical seminar, the public channels were all open. The participants who entered virtual reality could use voice, text, images, and even telepathically to communicate with each other. Everyone's information network was quite well informed. They were all very sensitive to the focus of the event. Wow, they really are up to date. The real scene is transcoded. It's not a simulation. Is this first-hand information? Where did it come from? Look at this perspective. It's a mosaic of satellite images. How many satellites did they call over? Then what do you think of this close-up view? The emotions and curiosity of the participants were quickly squeezed out by the fast-paced, high-intensity conference. In reality, the vast majority of meaningless exchanges were suppressed to the point where they disappeared without a trace by the time the demonstration advanced to the stage of the chase between the True God and Luo Nan. And when the grand scene of the sun will descending and the cloud pass shattering arrived, everyone was already dizzy from the dazzling scene and the enormous flow of information. Captain Jimmy was one of those who were dizzy. The entire process was played once in less than half an hour. The edited version was played at least 20 times, and the key joints were emphasized over and over 200 times. He was still dizzy even when he returned to the real world. His left eye was the sun, his right eye was lightning, and his brain was full of the cloud pass that was being assembled, burst apart, and then pieced back together. What the hell are they talking about? Yeah, most of it was just guessing. Men's effect of listening to the lecture wasn't much better than Captain Jimmy's. Of course, there were explanations in the real scene demonstration. But there were configurations on the left, configurations on the right, and some space-time structure in the middle. The storm of the gully region, coupled with the chaotic and complex structural analysis of the cloud pass, was completely directed in the direction of evaporating one's brain juice. Captain Jimmy was baffled. If one had to consider all these messy things during battle, how would one fight? Perhaps it was because of this that he was holed up in the operations team as a squad leader. But come to think of it, those who had a higher status and authority than him might not be any better off today. The information vibrated over. He glanced at it and felt a little dizzy again. F***CK. Those people from East Asia Institute. Huh, this is good. Mend was baffled. What's wrong? Hee, they're using us to return a favor. Huh. The tactical example just now, the one that just came out, seems to have returned the favor and taken it from the Amaterasu cult. For this, we have to return the favor and temporarily help the Amaterasu cult. We're helping the Amaterasu cult in Band City. Can we afford to? That's what it means, high-level thugs. Captain Jimmy didn't mind at all. Rather than working for someone else, he was more interested in getting out of this boring old warehouse and actually doing something useful. Whether it was dealing with the vagrants or higher-level enemies. Mend, on the other hand, was thinking about something more practical. Who should we contact with the Amaterasu cult? This. East Asia Institute is a little too much. Captain Jimmy was stunned. He looked at the contents of the mission again. There was no explanation in this regard at all. This was more troublesome. He tried to find the East Asia Institute to clarify things. Just then, he received an instant message. Captain Jimmy's expression changed immediately when he saw the message. Mend glanced at it and saw the words. By Sinyan. He snorted in his heart and instinctively thought of the worst. He looked at Captain Jimmy again. At this moment, his expression was even worse than Yan Yongbua's. In the sky above Ban City Airport, indicator lights and radio signals intertwined. After 4 to 5 hours of tossing and turning, the huge intercontinental airship returned to the airport. Sigh, on the airship that was about to land, Bai Xinyan sighed. Her slender fingers caressed her forehead, pretending to be weak. I told you that your soul power has evaporated and your mind is damaged. You need to rest. Why didn't you listen to me? Kitano Suzuto glanced at her. He had enough of her exaggerated acting skills. The one who didn't need to act to show that he was extremely worried was his boss. Yukawa Aisha gripped the outer edge of the space capsule tightly. His entire body was tense and rooted to the spot. It was as if he was facing a life and death situation. In fact, in Yukawa Aisha's eyes, the airship that was about to land at Ban City Airport and himself on the airship were bait that was about to be thrown into the devil's mouth. In the future, he would only be eroded by acid. It's all Luo Nan's fault. It's all Luo Nan's fault. Luo Nan. As for the exact number of tens of thousands of people, currently, there are already 90,000 stable cage bubbles on the altar spiderweb. 100,000. A stable cage represents an awakened who have cultivated successfully. How many people are there in the entire inner world? According to Luo Nan's impression of the latest statistics, the number of registered ability users in the entire world was only around 76,000. This was the result of explosive growth in the last half year. Of course, this number did not include the nomads of the wilderness, the military's burners, and the ever-increasing number of human mutants. But even if these people were included, the number of people bound to Luo Nan's altar spiderweb covered over 90% of the world's awakened. As for the ability users that were even further away, similar to worker Zhai before he awakened, their numbers were 10 times greater than the previous group. Without a doubt, this was another, full coverage. As for the bubbles of ordinary people that were born and extinguished with the passage of time, their scale was enormous, and their changes were rapid. They had already lost the meaning of statistics. Rather than calculating numbers, it was better to evaluate the breadth of the space they covered. It was more or less the same as the soul cloak. There definitely weren't this many in the past. Luo Nan had done a similar inventory before. It definitely wasn't on this scale. He had already guessed why. The daybreak nightmare is very powerful. The abyss world's might is boundless. But right now, this isn't the main point. Luo Nan's current name was only known by a few people in the government, the military, and the upper echelons of the business world. But from the perspective of the inner world, Luo Nan's name could already be said to shake the world. There was no one who didn't know him. Especially this sort of freshly minted extraordinary information. It involved extraordinaries, and it also stirred the secular world into action. It formed a news event with global influence. Anyone who was close to this circle could not avoid talking about it a few times. In this way, hundreds and thousands of people revolved around Luo Nan every minute and every second. Their thoughts unfolded, and they even conversed with this name. A storm of information and a maelstrom with no end gradually converged within the constantly changing space and time. If it were someone else, this storm would only exist within the transmission and storage of various media, relying on a material carrier to exist. But for Luo Nan, it was a different situation. The altar's spiderweb stood in the void, appearing and disappearing in the hearts of people. The noise that echoed in the mind was like the vibrating hum of mosquitoes and flies. Not only did it make clear the core meaning, it also informed every noise-making node without restraint of the location, medium of transmission, flow trajectory, and even emotional color. This was the resonance between the human communication network and the altar's spiderweb. It was the deep level of information in the material and mental domains. It was the comprehensive feedback of Luo Nan's deep and rich layers of senses. At this very moment, Luo Nan's eyes and the bottom of his heart reflected such a complicated background and complex world. It was precisely because of the complexity that the noise surged with large amounts of repetitive and redundant information. It formed a surging flood that washed over him without end. This is a bit annoying. Though he said this, Luo Nan's state of mind was still quite calm. It was unknown when it started, but dealing with this information storm that could collapse and burn brain cells had already become a part of Luo Nan's daily life. The grand structure of the living starry sky, the global coverage of the soul cloak, the trillions of fragments of the misty maze, the sun wheel and absolute purgatory formed together into the abyss world. Again and again, each wave was more powerful than the last. In the end, Luo Nan was equipped with an immunity. This made him no longer drift with the tide. Instead, he followed his own logic to buffer, precipitate, divide, and even analyze and integrate the enormous amount of information. In fact, the information storm that surrounded Luo Nan was much more regular than the attacks he had suffered before. The regularity represented familiarity and order. Luo Nan subconsciously muttered, "Oh me." At this time, he was the incarnation of a small wooden stick that reached into the cotton candy machine. From the grand structure of heaven, earth, and the hearts of people, he accumulated sugar threads to form a marvelous cloud-like creation. It would be quite good if he could create cotton candy with ordinary craftsmanship. But if he used himself as a yardstick, transformed his knowledge into rules, measured the hearts of people, and followed the law to create things. Luo Nan closed his eyes, and his thoughts naturally poured into the altar's spiderweb. Within the complex layers of the network, on the back of the wraith sign that climbed up and down, within the flood of information and life force that weaved back and forth, there seemed to be an incorporeal 3D printer operating, causing a certain silhouette to gradually appear. That appearance was that of Luo Nan. Compared to Luo Nan of the real world, the two were like human figures inside and outside a mirror. They were mirror images of each other. Only some of the details weren't perfect enough. They needed to be corrected. Chapter 860. Everyone has a heart that strives for perfection. They want to fix imperfections. Luo Nan's thoughts shuttled back and forth on the mirror image, comparing it with each other. It was more or less the action of looking into a mirror. And the more he examined and corrected it, the more detailed the mirror image revealed. This was not strange. This was because this was the accumulation of images, emotions, and calculations in the hearts of hundreds of thousands of people. Thanks to the blessing of modern imaging technology, very few people would mistake him. At the very least, they had a basic understanding of his appearance. This guaranteed the basic recognition of the mirror image. But under the appearance of convergence, everyone had their own understanding of Luo Nan in their hearts. Just as the saying goes, different people have different opinions. The vast majority of people had fixed impressions based on the guidance of various media, but they more or less had their own opinions. There were overpraise, prejudice, vilification. And they were using modern convenient channels of information to rapidly communicate with each other, influencing and overlaying each other. In this way, the corresponding accumulation of images became more and more cumbersome, redundant, complex, and contradictory. Most importantly, it was distorted. This gave Luo Nan the fulcrum to pry open people's hearts. But it was precisely this distortion that passed through the spiderweb of the altar and converged onto the mirror image. The surface was calm, but the inside was conflicting and colliding with each other. It could collapse and fall apart at any time. The reason why it did not collapse was because the mirror image existed in advance. It was the basic core that Luo Nan had already established. It was built on the foundation of formatting theory. It went through the polishing of the 9 orifices 6 roots martial arts philosophy. It went through the deepening of coupling theory, and it went through the immersion of the condensation ring and other configuration concepts. Luo Nan relied on this to construct the glorious and resplendent living starry sky, touching upon every corner of the complex and real world. Of course, the system brought by the Wraith sign had always surrounded and influenced him. And all of this, if traced back to the source, could be attributed to the abyssal world sun will and absolute hell. It was a vast and dangerous balance. Luo Nan had deduced this when he researched the lamination interference technique. Now he naturally used it. It was this clear dissection that anchored a relatively stable fulcrum for Luo Nan between heaven, earth, and the hearts of people. The changes of the wind and clouds in the surroundings had a fixed foundation. It could be deduced and born from basic rules. Of course, these rules were still fuzzy, but they were already divided into near and far, virtual and real and illusory. But in any case, he had walked the right path. Not only did the previous accumulations exist within the veil of invisibility, new elements were constantly precipitating. They grew in number and clarity. They originated from Luo Nan himself. They came from his core. All sorts of abilities, skills, and rules were analyzed within the core. They were transformed into materials and components, arranged in order. All sorts of designs were needed to be pieced together in order to finally form a complete and logical mask template. For example, based on the condensation ring, he had already derived skills such as the water drop sword and soul cloak. Going even more complicated, the cloud pass he had just created involved basic materials from other domains and was pieced together under the rules of the configuration system. But from the looks of it, this was just a semi-finished product. He needed to review and research many times before he could finally take shape. And even if he did take shape, this kind of template would be relatively monotonous. Was he supposed to go out and fight enemies? Was he supposed to hide inside like a tortoise? He needed to bring out a set of combo punches. Of course, this series of materials that belonged to Luo Nan had already been integrated into his current default template framework. Overall, it was already quite mature. And this default template seemed to be able to perform more perfectly than Luo Nan's body and soul framework. After all, this was the product of theorization. Speaking of which, the stacking interference technique was very much like an analytical tool when used. It could perform an in-depth analysis of the various elements contained within itself, or it could perform combinatorial experiments. It was simply like a laboratory cum dressing room. It was an extremely efficient operating environment. But no matter how efficient it was, Luo Nan still needed to expend quite a bit of effort to reassemble a new template, especially one that could completely conceal his identity. Luo Nan found a new toy, and his mind naturally fiddled with it. During this process, the mirror image on the altar's spiderweb and his true self in the real world intersected and fused on a deeper level. The space-time bubble around his body correspondingly transformed into a faintly discernible mist. It was lively and fleeting. It seemed to be supported by an incorporeal flow of air, and sunlight and moonlight rotated and poured into it. It transformed into boundless colors and shapes. And as he fiddled with it, the original decorations and the new products that had gradually accumulated flowed through his mind like a horse lantern, allowing him to inspect his memories. This one had just been precipitated. It was useful. It was too simple. This one looked very reliable, but he couldn't find the right door to enter. And this one. Luo Nan's mind suddenly came into contact with something that was half old and half new. It was like a bizarre mountain range hidden by clouds and mist. There were grotesque rocks and jagged rocks that spiraled and stacked on top of each other. They formed a structure of their own, and magma snaked and flowed within. At first glance, it looked like a mountain of flames in the depths of fiendish prison. But its relatively flat peak and its corresponding layout made it look more like a special altar model. The Blood Soul Temple. Chapter 861. Snake Tongue suddenly woke up from her meditative state. The living room of the yacht was empty. Lo was nowhere to be seen. The virtual work area was still lit up, and the interface was constantly refreshing with information. Ability users from all over the world were revolving around the hot topic of last night. Wave after wave of discussions were launched, and the keywords were none other than Luo Nan, the airship, the Amaterasu Order, and so on. For the spectators, the matter was over, and it was time for them to show their strength. But for the people involved, was it really over? Snake Tongue looked at the time. It was approximately 4 a.m. It had only been 5 or 6 hours since the intercontinental airship incident. The atmosphere in Band City was still very low, making her heart feel heavy. Snake Tongue adjusted her aura and followed the feeling in her heart. She slowly stood up. There was no one around, but she still took traditional steps out of the living room and took the small elevator to the upper deck. There were few lights on the passenger terminal, but the darkest hour had passed. The railings on the deck chairs, and other decorations all revealed their silhouettes in the dusk. At the same time, there was a figure at the bow of the ship, who knew how long it had been standing there. Secretary Yin. Madam North Mountain. Even though they had adjusted it many times, the way they addressed each other was not precise enough. They were unfamiliar and polite, just like their relationship. Don't you want to rest for a while? There are some matters in the headquarters that need to be dealt with. Thank you for your hard work. D City was 3 hours earlier than Band City, so it was about time to deal with things. Needless to say, some things did not care about time. Just like this moment. Snake Tongue only casually greeted him. Her gaze and mind were cast outside the yacht. The bow of the anchored yacht was pointing towards the east. The lake was vast, and one could see everything at a glance. One could even see the glaze that had been quietly painted on where the water met the sky. At this time, the ground was still being colored layer by layer. A few clouds were piled there randomly. Stirred by the changing colors, they vaguely turned into indigo mountains, adding a sense of composition to the design. Snake Tongue furrowed her brows slightly. She looked at the sky and clouds in the distance, which were gradually brightening. The feeling in her heart seemed to have been illuminated a little, but it still wasn't vivid enough. Lo followed her line of sight and gently exhaled. Is it sunrise? I thought there would be no sun today, thick clouds, and low atmospheric pressure. It doesn't feel good enough. The conversation that had been going on and on was suddenly stuck here. In fact, both sides of the conversation had captured a common understanding from each other's perception. They didn't say anything else and just stared at the boundary of the water and sky from afar. The sun was still below the horizon, but at this moment, in the layers of glaze, in the indigo mist mountain range, there was clearly a different type of power stirring restlessly. It was hidden deep under the vast laws of nature, but it could not wait to stretch out its claws. It was even half a step beyond the newborn sun. In the eastern horizon, it pressed out a ferocious shape. Yun! Lu exclaimed. The azure cloud peak that was piled up on the horizon suddenly collapsed. Then, under the distortion of that clear power, branches were pulled out, almost losing the nature that clouds should have, turning into the shadow that came with that power, following the contours of the sky and the water body, extending in all directions. The amount of clouds over there wasn't much. After a few stretches, they became so thin that they couldn't be seen. However, the image of the roots spreading out, piercing into the void, and supporting the structure of water and sky was still deeply engraved in Snake Tongue and Enli's pupils and hearts. The Fusang Divine Tree. Snake Tongue subconsciously extended her hand, wanting to cover her eyes, but it was already too late. She lowered her arm halfway, and her face turned pale. She had just looked directly at the operation of a high-level power and subconsciously analyzed it. It had caused quite a bit of a backlash for her. Who knew how many unlucky people were like her in the past few minutes in the entirety of Ban City? Yinlu was much better off because she was already used to borrowing the power of the Blood Soul Temple of the Abyss District to observe high-level things. Although the Blood Soul Temple of the Abyss District seemed to have changed again. What method is this? Yinli's mind was suspended in the Abyss District, painstakingly distinguishing the deeper meaning behind the turbulent storm. Unfortunately, her level wasn't high enough. She became more and more confused as she watched. It's nothing more than a seal. Snake Tongue was unable to sense the details, but she understood the gist of it even more. It's not a good thing. Yinli's thoughts were chaotic. The Amaterasu Order wants to make a move in Ban City. This is their headquarters. This isn't the first time. Snake Tongue paused for a moment, then concluded, it just depends on who they're targeting. Yinlu suddenly turned her head. Where is Mr.? Yeah, where was Luonan? Even at this critical moment, that person had stubbornly disappeared without a trace. Whether it was Snake Tongue or Yinlu, they could half guess and half feel the faint light of the first rays of dawn. They could feel the gradually extending and gradually permeating psychic pressure. There was still a bit of coolness in the northern mountain lake during the early hours of the morning. It forcefully appeared in the very center of the work area. The bright red words were extremely glaring. Most importantly, the poster was from the Ban City branch of the Ability User Society. Yinli's wristband buzzed and vibrated at this moment. She lowered her head to glance at it, and her brows furrowed even tighter. This is troublesome. The forum post opened as she spoke. The information on the wristband was split into two screens and projected onto the work area. The reason why Yinlu did this was because the things described on both sides were exactly the same. Even the words and sentences used were exactly the same. The gist of it was that Ban City's side discovered that an extremely dangerous mutant had infiltrated. The Amaterasu Order was righteous and had taken the initiative to open a so-called divine nation to protect the safety of the citizens. The Ban City branch demanded that all ability users in Ban City immediately register online and report their location as well as the brief situation of the nearby ability users. They were to cooperate with the Ban City government and the SCA in conducting a comparison of social authority in order to ensure safety and so on. Big So's entire city. Is the Ban City branch sticking their faces under the feet of a true god? Are they willing to act like cows and horses to play with? The above words weren't said by Yinlu or Snake Tongue. It was the ridicule of some spectator on the forum. However, this person's words hit the nail on the head. As an Ability User Society branch organization without an extraordinary overseeing it, the Ban City branch had already been reduced to a vassal of the Amaterasu Order over a decade ago. Normally, it was invisible. Now that it had jumped out, it was nothing more than a marionette on stage. This is, looking for Mr. Yinlu and Snake Tongue looked at each other once more. They both felt that trouble was imminent. The power of the Amaterasu Order, coupled with the semi-official nature of the Ban City branch, really did possess something akin to a legal coercion in the inner world. It was more or less the same as, fight if you don't accept it. Even if they were cooperating, Yinlu could go register, but she was the only candidate who could register. It was true that Snake Tongue had an ordinary identity in Ban City, but in the end, it was just a facade. She had always hidden her true identity and notoriety. Not to mention Luonan, who had made his debut under the name of Mr. Mo. However, there was no such person as Mr. Mo in this world. Even though Inle had left some arrangements in D City over the past 2 days, it was enough to deal with normal situations. The people on the ship gathered together and corroborated each other. The logical clues were chaotic. To sum it up, suspects. However, wasn't this a bit of a roundabout way too big? I thought we were going to charge into geosynchronous orbit and then turn back. Isn't Mars better? Captain Jimmy walked into the main hall with large strides. He had circled back from the Quantum Corporation branch in Band City. The private airship had just finished connecting with his flying craft. However, the sarcasm in his words was not limited to his family's itinerary. Bai Xinyan could be seen from afar standing in front of a projected area that was not yet clear. Her complexion was normal, and she was even smiling and greeting Captain Jimmy. Next to her was Yukawa Isuk. He had an unlucky expression on his face. He was sickly and dispirited. He turned a blind eye to Captain Jimmy's arrival. "You're beating around the bush because you can't find him. Hee, you're still so self-confident." Captain Jimmy was still a bit confused about the new mission he had been assigned. He only knew that he was to assist the Amaterasu Order in finding a powerful individual who had been in hiding for a long time. However, this did not stop him from fiercely attacking Bai Xinyan when the opportunity presented itself. This is the truth. The Amaterasu Order has used methods that are close to flipping the table. From sunrise until now, they still haven't locked onto their target. Bai Xinyan carelessly brought up the Amaterasu Order. It said that this is due to the surrounding area having some convoluted and distorted spacetime dimensions. Excluding natural phenomena, it's the interference of the extraordinary plane. It's a shielding interference. It's also a big problem. The one who concluded was a middle-aged man of unclear age. He did not come here in person, but rather appeared in the projection area. The most direct impression he gave others was that he was bald. His eyebrows and beard were sparse, and his skin was pale. He gave others the feeling that he didn't have enough nutrients to support the growth of his hair. He looked very thin and weak. Perhaps this had something to do with the large robe he wore. The 7th generation Dynamo Core had already recorded the data of all the extraordinaries in the world, and it was updated in real time. Captain Jimmy completed the match in the first instance. He immediately straightened his legs and puffed out his chest. "Your Majesty." This bald middle-aged man was the Pope of the 100 Collections. Jimmy was still puzzled. This Majesty had just finished attacking Luo Nan, yet he came back to find trouble. Where was the logic? Captain Jimmy was not an idiot. He looked at the 3 people gathered before him and thought of last night's arduous training. He suddenly grasped the inner connection within. Trouble equals Luo Nan. Was this scene set up for Luo Nan? But wasn't that fellow several thousand kilometers away? Could it be that he had returned? Bai Xinyan suddenly asked, "Your Majesty, do you think that there's someone behind Luo Nan?" There's no need to rush to conclusions. The Pope of the 100 Collections faintly smiled. His face was sparse with hair, and his expression was amiable. The truth is that there's a strange existence in Band City right now. He's suspected to be an extraordinary, but he's different from all the other extraordinaries on Earth. Of course, we need to investigate his background. He might not be a living person. If he's not a living person, then what is he? It's hard to estimate. The initial probing won't have any results. After all, I'm not proficient in the mental side. The Pope of the Amaterasu Order, Majesty, was the spiritual leader of millions of believers. He was the world's top mental extraordinaire. For him to say that he wasn't proficient in the mental side was truly the biggest joke in the world. The Pope still smiled amiably. You can't view the convenience of horse racing as an ability. Besides, there's no future in the mental side. Perhaps you agree. Captain Jimmy discovered that he couldn't get a word in edgewise. He was the same as Yukawa Aishuk next to him. They were completely superfluous. He only heard Bai Xinyan respond. The road ahead was paved by a character like Majesty. How could I think so much? Oh, the registration of the Band City branch has been updated. Tell me about it. Currently, there are more than 3,400 people registered. Among them, 700 are at least awakened. As she spoke, Bai Xinyan projected another distribution map. With Band City as the background, the map was dotted with dots of varying density. Next to him, Yukawa Aishuk's pupils dilated slightly. He secretly compared the image with the information he had. He felt that this included almost all the secret orders and supernatural organizations in Osaka. Even if it wasn't 100% accurate, it was close to 80% accurate. Not enough, the Pope said simply. The time limit isn't up yet. This is a problem of attitude. I will convey Majesty's opinion. Bai Xinyan shrugged. Next, Majesty, please arrange for your subordinates to communicate with the various orders and organizations in Band City. The Band City branch and the SCA will send a message to those who have records but haven't voluntarily registered. If necessary, they will visit and urge them. All work will be completed by 1:30 p.m. By that time, Band City will have more or less been plowed, and we can begin the next phase of the operation. Captain Jimmy also stared at the distribution map and searched for relevant information. His mind was racing. After a few seconds, he suddenly spoke. Does our team also need to report? Bai Xinyan glanced at him. Her eyes were clear and calm, but in Captain Jimmy's eyes, there was a hidden meaning. He liked this, especially liked to destroy this. So, he spoke again. For the past few days, we have been neighbors with a few aptitude users. We also watched them work and discuss business. They probably aren't locals of Band City. So far, it seems like they haven't registered yet. Chapter 862. Around 10 in the morning in Band City, after nearly 6 hours of fermenting, the internal forum of the Ability User Association was already overflowing with noise. Once the matter was related to personal interests and dignity, the thoughts of the spectators would become a direct sense of immersion. Then it would transform into corresponding emotions. This was what was known as the will of the people. Of course, this sort of thing erased the warm and tender feelings of the so-called legal principles of social order. When it came to crossing the chasm of strength, it was mostly useless. The most obvious evidence was the progress of the registration. It was still advancing steadily, forming a densely woven net that tightened one's flesh. This sort of method completely relied on superior resources to crush them. There wasn't the slightest bit of ingenuity, yet it left people helpless. Truthfully speaking, there was always a bit of buffer space within the crushing of society's resources alone. What truly gave the ability users in Band City a sense of oppression and suffocation was the sunlight that sprinkled down to every corner of the city. The sun had already risen to the top of their heads. Its heat and penetrative power continued to rise. It didn't matter if one was outdoors or indoors. It didn't matter if one was exposed to direct sunlight or hidden in the shadows. The all-pervasive light waves could always permeate the surroundings of people. They carried the tyrannical interference imprint of the Amaterasu order. They were like demonic eyes floating in the air, radiating a gaze filled with blazing malice. Ian Lo and Snake Tongue were on the bottom deck. For the first time, they felt resentment towards the brilliant lighting design of this area. They had already closed the light baffles of the portholes, isolating them as much as possible from the sunlight. The lights inside were also extinguished to distinguish the direction of the penetrating light. The entire living room was dusky. The only source of light was the virtual work area. Subconsciously, Ian Lo and Snake Tongue had already stopped conversing. Their body movements grew less and less. They even stopped looking at the constantly refreshing forum messages. They each occupied a different angle, curled up their bodies, and restrained their auras. It was as if they were in a narrow and claustrophobic cage under 24-hour surveillance. They were like clay sculptures or wooden statues. They didn't know whether or not they had already been exposed. In fact, it didn't matter whether they knew or not. Right now, all responses and all pretenses would become weak and laughable in the face of the chasm that was like a heavenly moat. Frequently coming into contact with existences of that level, they had a corresponding introspection and self-awareness. Time passed little by little. Whether it was Yin-Lu or Snake Tongue, they were both shocked. In comparison, Yin-Li's mental strength was a notch lower. Her habitually suppressed telepathic thought had a clear increase. It was as if a bomb had been set off in a relatively quiet space. Who is it? A pitiful person who works for some boss. Perhaps the other party felt that this explanation was too confusing, so she added, to put it nicely, I'm like a secretary or a maid. To put it bluntly, I'm like a leashed cat or dog. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm called Cat Eyes. When the other party frankly introduced herself, the latent power that had burst forth from the stimulation of their telepathic exchange returned to tranquility. It quickly settled down, just like a flash of light that had been polished and then extinguished. It was just that after settling down, the flickering embers naturally possessed a certain law. When Cat Eyes finished introducing herself, the result of the law's guidance had already changed from a quantitative change to a qualitative change. It had accumulated to a meaning of existence that could be sensed by the 3 female ability users of similar statuses. This was a relatively meticulous structure, and it possessed an extremely distinct sense of space. Cat Eyes, Snake Tongue, and Yin-Lu resided on the mental plane. Their eyes, ears, mouth, nose, and all sorts of other senses, as well as their perception of the external material world, were separated by a layer. Only the mental plane, the law and order that gradually became clear, gradually appeared in a pattern that they could understand. The feeling of the flash of light in the dark room was far too vivid, so much so that the 3 of them still felt that this was a dusky room of unknown size. They maintained a relatively close distance between each other, similar to the type where they stood side by side. Due to the accumulation of changes in their perception, Snake Tongue and Yin-Lu weren't able to react in time to Cat Eye's self-introduction. Only after a few seconds did Yin-Lu speak: Cat Eyes. Xia City's Cat Eyes. After half a year of in-depth understanding, Yin-Lu naturally knew that Cat Eyes was a member of Luo Nan's circle of friends. But for them to meet under these circumstances, it seemed that their identities weren't as simple as just friends. If it was a deeper layer, was she a forbidden zone? It had to be said that Cat Eyes' attitude gave the 3 a good start in their interaction. Under her good example, and of course within Luo Nan's domain, Snake Tongue and Yin-Lu had no meaning in hiding their identities. Their self-introductions naturally came. There was a certain awkwardness in this period of time. After all, their identities and positions were more or less contradictory in the public social network of the inner world. However, Cat Eyes didn't nitpick. Whether it was Yin-Lu, who came from the Blood Flame Order, who was deeply involved in the Sun Jai intermediary case, or Yin-Lu, who was once her mortal enemy, Snake Tongue, who was theoretically missing or even dead, she only clicked her tongue twice. She quickly returned to a more realistic level. You guys are all in Band City. What are you helping him do? Work. Daily life. Warm the bed. We're just listening to Mr.'s arrangements. Yin-Lu appropriately followed up, allowing the idle chatter to have a relatively smooth relay. Things aren't going well now that the Divine Kingdom's canopy has opened, right? That's true. Is there any news or reaction from Xia City? There's an uproar, but we're just watching the excitement. But looking at your current situation. Cat Eyes snorted twice. Everyone says that the boss fought a battle with the Amaterasu Order on the Pacific Ocean. Now that he's overcome his calamity and broken through, he's like a flying bird and a jumping fish. But if that's the case, it doesn't seem to be the case. It's a bit complicated. Ian Lee's mood was indeed quite complicated. I understand your feelings, but it's the same as before. I really don't understand what in the world is going through someone's mind. His lordship's previous arrangements were always like this. Snake Tongue joined in as well. Their telepathic communication was a bit more straightforward than usual. Yeah. It's a mess. But in the end, he's always forcefully rescuing the situation, giving people the misconception that he's unfathomable. Cat Eyes was happy to introduce her experiences to these two latecomers, even though she didn't really understand the current situation. In the past, Cat Eyes often borrowed the living starry sky, the large production line, and other similar mental domain structures to launch a long-distance mental link with Luo Nan. But those were relatively abstract mediums. It was like facing the void, crossing unexplainable dimensions. But in the current situation, it seemed that there was a solid structure that gathered the souls of the three together. It was like, before they could make a clearer judgment, light and shadow appeared within the empty room. Moreover, it formed into a visual image that could be easily understood. The first thing that appeared was the scenery of a chaotic sky filled with clouds. They could even hear astral winds blowing past, whistling through the air. The sound and color were both present and extremely vivid. In this special stage, Cat Eyes and the other two quickly thought back to the scene from last night. Cat Eyes snorted again, "What's going on?" A fortress in the clouds, a falling sun, yesterday reappearing. Ian Lo was probably thinking the same thing. On the other hand, Snake Tongue's thoughts had an additional layer. Perhaps this was the cloud world that had trapped her for half a year. As the thoughts of the three deviated, the image that appeared changed. Is there? There isn't. Ian Lo was very baffled. Her current mental state was also very baffled. Her mind was naturally divided into two parts. One part was communicating with people in the movie theater that was neither real nor fake, unable to see through the bewilderment barrier. The other part was stationed in the Abyss District. It was closely connected to the structure of the Blood Soul Temple in the Abyss District, forming a transparent high-level clairvoyance. The two parts of her mind didn't conflict. They were both real and real. Gradually, she could feel the structure of the Blood Soul Temple in the Abyss District. There existed a rather rhythmic warped undulation. This caused her mind to sway, and she was quite pleasantly surprised. It was probably because this feeling was very familiar. She would come back to it from time to time in the past half year. According to Mrs. Halder, this was someone's usual experimental method. The foundation of the Blood Flame Order was essentially nothing more than a set of experimental products for that person. As the deputy first oblatum of the order, it was actually a bit difficult for Ian Lo to adapt to this rhythm. But under the current circumstances, this distortion that affected the foundation of her extraordinary strength was like a gently swaying swing. It brought her along to leisurely sway. Everything was out of her control, but it was inexplicably safe and secure. "Mr." the thought appeared in the movie theater. Before it could completely take shape, Cat Eyes let out a "whoa" from the side. There really is one. The background of the image of the blue sky and white clouds suddenly had the color of blood spread out. Moreover, it appeared at the center of the mist fortress that Ian Lo spoke of. The newly emerged elements possessed a very strong sense of space. It was as if they had entered another world through a hole in the depths of the mist. There were towering rocks and flowing bloody light. Below it was a hot lake of lava, and above it floated turbid clouds and lightning. It was malevolent and terrifying. It was similar to the demonic realm's ghost prison. Within the movie theater, one could even hear the muffled sounds of lava boiling and flowing. Ian Lee's mind finally became confused. She couldn't distinguish the relationship between the structure of the Blood Soul Temple in the Clear Abyss district and the image of the Blood Soul Temple in front of her. She subconsciously muttered to herself, "The Blood Soul Temple?" Before Cat Eyes and Snake Tongue could react to this, a living creature with wings suddenly emerged from the chaotic cluster of clouds. It was accompanied by a long and hoarse cry as it charged out. Its shape was similar to a prehistoric pterosaur. It had a sharp beak, a thin neck, long wings, and a thick tail. Its entire body was featherless and covered in scales. The most astonishing thing was that these things were actually in groups. When the leader appeared, a dark mass of people followed behind, stacking upon each other. Amidst the clamorous cries, they spat out a large amount of acid. It was like a violent gale and a sudden shower of rain that rolled down. The cloud was wrapped in acid rain. Suddenly, lightning flashed and thunder roared. Amidst the crackling sounds of exploding lightning, a group of beetles resembling a black cloud appeared. It was unknown how many thousands or tens of thousands of them buzzed out. What followed was an absurd amount of meteors that were thrown down. However, halfway through, one could see that each and every one of them had their limbs bunched up. It was difficult to distinguish their stone humanoid forms as they were thrown down towards the bottomless layer of clouds, and this was just the beginning. In a few breaths of time, there were countless waves of marvelous creatures that appeared from within the cluster of clouds and lightning. Behind them, there were even man-made flying machines and large mechas rushing out. Occasionally, there would be a few illusory human figures whose faces could not be seen clearly. They either spiraled in the air, dropped down at high speeds, or attacked each other. They occupied the entire screen of the image. The three female ability users in the movie theater seemed to be watching an absurd fantasy war film. It also seemed as if they had fallen into some absurd dreamland. A more rational way of looking at it would be like someone had taken multiple shots and spliced them together into a video work. At the same time, it was presented in this large background. Not to mention the effects of the editing, just the logic of the shots was enough to make one feel despair. If one had to find a common point from this mess of images, then it would probably be this: every image of an existence manifested an extraordinary power. Moreover, every power seemed to be rather out of the ordinary. This was especially true for the few illusory human figures that pierced out from the back. Most of them were only wrapped in a single layer of armor. Some of them even wore unlined clothing and were unarmed. Yet, every movement they made pierced through the sky and collapsed the clouds. They roared through the wind and thunder. It was as if they were gods manifesting themselves. It should be said that everyone was an extraordinary. The image of Cat Eyes in the movie theater very naturally assumed a posture of supporting her chin with her legs crossed. Your Blood Soul Temple is actually a summoning class. That's not funny. Not to mention the two conversing, Snake Tongue was watching seriously to the side. She was dizzy from watching, but at the same time, she had some strange sensations. She seemed to be able to hear some sort of noise amidst the unbearably chaotic background noise of the fantasy war film. It was extremely muffled and rather chaotic. The additional noise seemed to be the whispers and discussions of these people. In addition, there was also clatter, clatter, clatter. It was unknown when, but the fine sound of trembling chains had emerged from within the turbid mist soulfire. It rang in their ears, and it was also boundlessly far away. If one were to carefully experience it, it would seem as though the chains were probing out from the depths of their souls. One end was locked, and the other end was connected. They were connected to a boundless and enormous net of chains. Every person within the movie theater, regardless of whether they were complete or incomplete, was a tiny node in this enormous net. This Cat Eyes clearly recalled the nightmare from a few days ago. This memory was conveniently shared with the other two, and the corresponding emotions were transmitted back. Her willpower was trembling unconsciously. The structure before her eyes was becoming more and more different from the movie theater. It was to the point that a more suitable name was given: an altar. An enormous altar. An innumerable number of believers surrounded the surroundings, attentively watching the chaotic image in the center, or perhaps it could be called a miracle. They also offered their souls to the miracle. The power of the sacrifice transformed into invisible flames that resonated with the miracle on the altar. It provided energy and also refined the images, allowing the gaps to be mended and naturally transition until they became one. Within the space of the altar, there were millions and millions of souls. The chains connected, sacrificed, and smelted, forming a complete closed loop. This was no longer a movie. The vivid and lifelike images and inconceivable scenes were merely embroidery that floated on the outer layer of true power. As the power trembled, it seemed to exist in the form of a living being. As for what the deeper nature of this power was, just below the trembling embroidery, a ferocious shadow suddenly appeared. Although it was only half a body, one could already see the ugly appearance of a human face, an arachnid body, and 6 different colored pupils. The instant this demonic shadow appeared, the surroundings of the entire altar seemed to be burning with a layer of raging flames. The flames scorched the mind and scattered fear. It was as if all the destructive power within the chaotic image in the center was projected onto the plane of reality. But it was only as if. The malevolent demonic shadow arched its body halfway out when a foot stomped heavily on its back. A complete and familiar silhouette of a human stepped on the arachnid demonic shadow, appearing within the vision of the consciousness of the 3 clear-headed people. Luo Nan. The embroidery of true power trembled even more violently. It was thanks to them that the body of power, which was originally invisible and unfathomable, had vaguely transformed into an enormous cloak. It encircled Luo Nan's body, conforming to the marvelous rhythm of Luo Nan's existence as it trembled and tumbled. They could only see that Luo Nan was the core of the cloak, but they could not see where it extended to. Luo Nan created all of this. He dominated all of this. He obtained all of this. He was at the center of the cloak. He was at the center of the altar. He was at the center of the entire system. He controlled and bore the weight of all of this. Therefore, he naturally became the focal point of everything. He did not look in any direction. He was like a statue of a god worshipped in a temple, watching over everyone. Cat Eyes could feel that the other 2 had already assimilated into the scene. Although they had entered later, they were more receptive to this scene than she was. Perhaps this was how the Luo Nan in their hearts should be. But she thought about their first meeting a few months ago. She thought about their contact in reality and compared it to the image before her eyes. She subconsciously felt an even more intense tremble. This bit of emotional reaction was soon drowned in that damned resonance. Perhaps it was precisely because of this resonance that the rhythm of the noise that made one's scalp go numb became even more distinct. In the end, it unified into some sort of hymn. Millions and millions of people chanted in unison. Cat Eyes chanted along, but the contents of her chant were far too vague. She chanted a bit in a muddled daze. She vaguely felt that the enormous cloak was a bit closer to her. It fluttered and brushed past her face. It flooded her mind, covering her in an unknown layer. All of the distractions completely receded at this moment. Only the words of praise emerged from the bottom of her heart. They curled up like smoke as they rose unhurriedly. My heart is a prison, my heart is a furnace, my heart is a mirror, my heart is a nation. Chapter 863. Snake Tongue sank into a dream that was hard to wake up from. She was originally at the side of the enormous altar in the movie theater, resonating with the countless believers and praising the inconceivable Lord. Her soul nearly melted into it. But she didn't know when it started, but she had already entered an even more absurd space. There was no process or transition, no sufficiently convincing logic. It truly was like a dream. But this dreamland was becoming more and more real. Snake Tongue seemed to have arrived at a battlefield filled with endless cannon fire. That's right, it was a battlefield. The logic of the dream was rapidly becoming complete, giving her an incomparably deep and conclusive impression. She had sunk into the center of the chaotic war zone. She was surrounded by impregnable fortresses. Rumbling war machines could be seen everywhere. Countless soldiers, wearing exoskeleton armors, operated fighter aircrafts, shuttles, and large-scale mechas. They were currently engaged in a selfless slaughter. As for their enemies, they were extraordinary life forms similar to mutants. Many of them were once elements of the movie theater in front of her. There were also some that were simply the giant bloody apes flying back and forth in the cloud world. The battle between the two sides was so intense that Snake Tongue couldn't avoid being drawn in. She couldn't even tell who was friend and who was foe. She was only driven by some unknown power. She confronted every threatening target that appeared in her surroundings and was killed. It was that simple. Snake Tongue's strength was too mediocre in this battlefield. The most frightening thing was that she couldn't keep up with the rhythm of the war. As a cursemancer, she wasn't used to this kind of chaotic, intense, and tornado-like killing situation. It was as if she had sunk into an enormous meat grinder. The gaps she could survive through were narrow and cramped. The slightest bit of carelessness would cause her to be crushed into meat paste. After the pain of death passed, she would be reborn in a different location on the same battlefield and once again sink into an endless battle. At first, Snake Tongue was at a loss. What was going on? What kind of logic was this? But later on, she was killed so many times that she didn't have any room to ponder. This was because even if it was a dream, the pain she felt at the moment of death was so real that it made one shiver. Beheading, piercing the heart, chopping the waist, dismembering the corpse, incinerating it, corroding it. In the meat grinder of the battlefield, the death that Snake Tongue had once abandoned her dignity and self to avoid came in different forms. There was only the strong and the weak. There was no way to avoid it. Even though the endless rebirths had partly reduced the horror between life and death, the instincts of life still made her try her best to avoid such an ending. She fought with other people and defeated the enemy, but it would not take long before she was killed again and had to experience a new way of death. Death might be like a dream, but the pain was accumulating. Perhaps when things reached an extreme, they would turn in the opposite direction. When people were too numb, they would eventually gain calmness. She didn't know how many times she died, but in a split second, Snake Tongue suddenly had an epiphany. At that time, when she was in a state of chaos between life and death, a beam of light pierced through her and made her whole body transparent. She shivered subconsciously. Then, what she sensed was not only the noisy and bloody battlefield, but also a pair of cold and penetrating eyes. The eye was embedded in a corner of this dreamscape. It could even be said that the entire dreamscape was the embodiment of the eye. That's right. The eyes were coldly watching her struggle for her life, displaying everything she had learned and revealing every trump card she had. They were also watching how much her flesh and skin could withstand, and how she would collapse and decay. Just like that, Snake Tongue was seen through from inside out. Snake Tongue was no longer confused. It was Luo Nan. She didn't know when it started, but all the inconceivable things she encountered were inextricably linked to Luo Nan. And as long as she had this central axis, all logic would be straightened out. Snake Tongue suddenly understood her current role. A test subject tied to the table. She didn't have any strength to fight back. She could only watch as the cold boy reached over and cut open her clothes, skin, and all her barriers and defenses. The cruel battlefield was the operating table. Luo Nan used this method to strip her, dismember her, and dissect her. He took apart every inch of her flesh, every organ, every bone, and every nerve. He tested the process of them twisting, deforming, and falling apart under different conditions. Then he reassembled and reassembled them. He even smeared oil and waxed them. He preserved and maintained them. He waited for them to recover to their original state before throwing them into a new round of experiments. This was how Snake Tongue felt. She struggled and fought within this absurd dreamland. But in the more realistic dimension, she just let Luo Nan do as he pleased. She didn't have the strength to fight back. Luo Nan used this method to understand the limits of her fleshly body, the limits of her mind, and some details that even she herself didn't know about. The sudden realization was unable to alleviate any of the pain. Instead, it made her feel even more despair because of the clarity. Snake Tongue didn't know how long this experience would last. She was going to collapse. She was really going to collapse. Even though Luo Nan had displayed deference and obedience that left her flabbergasted, it was unknown if she was unwilling in her heart. As a believer, disrespectful thoughts were ingrained in their hearts. It was fine normally, but if they were to reveal such thoughts during the state of the Great Sacrifice, even for a sect as idealistic as the Blood Flame Order, the backlash they had to endure was rather terrifying. Needless to say, Luo Nan had already displayed the clear image of a god. As the saying goes, the gods of heaven and earth are clearly visible. They cannot be slandered. Snake Tongue was extremely intelligent. How could she have made a mistake in this matter? Looking at Snake Tongue's current situation, especially her gaze, she was in a weak and sensitive state. She had avoided the extremes of numbness and despair. She might not be in too much pain, but fear was deeply rooted in her heart. She was like a dark fire in an underground coal seam. It was silent, but it couldn't be extinguished. It was unknown how it would burn for hundreds or thousands of years. She had probably been beaten quite ruthlessly. Yin Lo was inexplicably proud of herself. She felt that she should say a few words of comfort and comfort. The change in her mind was quite subtle. Her wristband vibrated at this time. She looked at the caller ID. It was Alpine Rong 3. Alpine Rong 3 had been maintaining a frequency of contact with Yin Lo every 2 or 3 days for the sake of discussing business. It wasn't a big deal. However, it was hard to avoid people thinking a bit more under these circumstances. Yin Lo put aside the matter of Snake Tongue for now. She pondered for a few seconds, and after another vibration, she connected the call. Alpine Rong 3's gentle voice, which was quite different from his appearance, rang out. Mrs. Yin, good day. Hello, Mr. Alpine. Is there something you need? There is indeed something. Sure enough, Alpine Rong 3 called at this time to talk about the matter of registration. With the Amaterasu order behind the scenes, the bureaucratic system of Osaka City was mobilized. The so-called registration could really be played around with. For a business entity like the Great Marsh Order that spanned the secular world and the inner world, there were many items to be filled out for registration. Not to mention the clergy of their own shrine, the employees of the association, and those with an inner world background, they had to send over a name list. Even people with recent business cooperation, as long as they were ability users, had to write a brief so that they could mutually verify. If they found it troublesome and didn't report or omitted to report, well, they might violate the relevant public security regulations. At that time, even if they had already signed a cooperation agreement, they might not be able to pass the Peace Trade Council or even the Osaka city government's investigation. All information please be submitted through the designated channels before 1:30 p.m. in the afternoon. 1:30 p.m. in the afternoon. Our order also has property in Osaka City. We also have quite a few ability users. It's not easy to calculate. Isn't the time a bit tight? There's no room for discussion. If Madame Yin still doesn't understand the gravity of the situation, then please take a look at the relevant notice and immediately begin the relevant work. Ha! There seemed to be someone speaking on the other side. It paused for a few seconds before suddenly changing to a different person. It was clearly a man's voice. His throat was rough, as if he always had phlegm stuck in his throat, ready to spit out at any time. Deputy First Ablatamine. The other side asked despite knowing the answer. It felt like she was an extremely powerful person. Inla said suspiciously, "You are." The administrative department and SA have sufficient evidence to prove that a portion of the restricted personnel of the peaceful trade market are suspected of making false registrations in this matter. These people maintain close contact with you. In order to clear the suspicion of your order, please immediately submit the relevant information. Inla furrowed her brows. I just said that the statistics are very difficult. The other side responded firmly, if there are difficulties, then overcome them. I'll give you an hour to submit all the information before 11 a.m., or else bear the consequences. Inlo was so angry that she laughed. This group of people from the Saka City branch were all cowards in front of the Amaterasu order. How dare they put on such a show at this time? The tone on the other side became even more ruthless. Listen up, Saka City is not the Blood Flame Order's territory, and the peaceful trade market is even more so. You can do business if you want, but if you mix in sand, I'll make you regret stepping on this land. This didn't sound like the tone of the Saka City branch. It sounded more like a violent person. Inlo stopped laughing. Who are you? A judge to confirm your crimes and hand them over to the flames of heaven to carry out the holy judgment. The other side directly cut off the communication. Who was this inexplicable fellow? Inle had a deep impression of that person's voice and domineering attitude. However, what left the deepest impression was still the words, flames of heaven. He's definitely not a member of the Saka City branch. He should be someone from the Amaterasu order. That's not the case. Snake Tongue said in a low voice from the corner. From his tone, he should be an important figure in the Heaven faction. He's most likely the leader, Goto Masayoshi. Goto Masayoshi. Upon receiving Snake Tongue's reminder, a certain piece of information hidden deep in the corner of Ian Lee's memory was activated. Should it be said that it reverberated like thunder? Of course, he's more like a mad dog that can't be provoked. Currently, the leash is in the hands of the Amaterasu order. Without a doubt, this was a vicious dog raised by the Amaterasu order. It was a knife in the hands of the Pope and the true gods, the kind that could be thrown away at any time. Even Goto Masayoshi himself should understand this point. However, this was a guy who was deeply addicted to gambling. He used the time in the hands of the Pope and the true gods to put on enough tiger skin for himself. He also possessed the corresponding strength and status. It was this kind of guy. Once he set his mouth, he wouldn't let go until he tore his target to shreds. This kind of organization, this kind of guy, was very compatible with the current environment. They turned the absolute superiority of the Amaterasu order in Saka City into a substantial threat that was pressed against everyone's throat. Inlo could almost hear that snoring sound coming from the throat of the vicious dog. She already had a headache before they even started fighting. In such a short period of time, Inlo also couldn't think of a suitable solution. At this time, an internal communication call came in. It was from Captain Krawashi on the front deck. As Ian Lee's most capable subordinate in Saka City, this senior retired officer reported with some worry, the authority of the yacht has been cut off. If we can't get the follow-up permission from SA, the yacht can't even drive out of the passenger terminal. As an ability user, no one expected to rely on a yacht to do anything. However, this was undoubtedly a warning, and a very impolite one at that. Ian Lee's face sank. She seriously thought for a few minutes. Finally, she decided to call Ryoso Okuhira again to understand the situation. In fact, she wanted to call the veteran directly. However, the status of the two sides was still a bit unequal. No matter what happened to the veteran, if they were caught talking to each other, it would be hard to avoid suspicion that they paid more attention to the veteran, although this was the truth. Inla didn't want to provide Goto Masayoshi with a bargaining chip to threaten him. The call to Ryoso Okuhira didn't go through immediately. However, 30 seconds later, the other side sent back a video call request. Inla felt a bit strange. However, she still chose to accept it. Of course, before that, she didn't forget to turn on the lights in the living room. Mr. Okuhira. Just now, Inla forcefully swallowed back the words she wanted to say. Because in the projection screen, not only did the ugly but familiar face of Ryoso Okuhira appear, there was also a man who was almost 2 times thinner. His skin was deathly pale, like a skeleton. This guy who looked like a drug addict maintained a rather intimate distance from Ryoso Okuhira. He grinned and said, "Ms. Inlu, right? Unfortunately, I caught evidence again. You secretly colluded with your business partner to confess. Don't explain. I gave you an hour. In the end, you did these meaningless things. This is disrespect to me." She didn't need to look at this face. Just by listening to the greasy throat that seemed to be filled with phlegm, Inla knew who the person in front of her was. The mad dog with many layers of tiger skin, Goto Masayoshi. The real contact, Ryoso Okuhira, expressionlessly stood at the side. He didn't give Inlu any hint. Or, it could be said that his iron-like face was the most obvious hint. Goto Masayoshi grinned a bit more. "Ms. Inlu, you really are a beauty. This makes my mood a lot better. I don't mean to be disrespectful. I'm just stating the truth. Otherwise, I wouldn't even say a word more. The inspection of the factory is about to be over. After solving the matter of the day's processing factory, I will continue to communicate with you. I hope that at that time, you can give me the name list of the relevant personnel. Otherwise, I will have another explanation." Inla coldly stared at Goto Masayoshi. She had already labeled him as a scum of society in her heart. However, this guy's background was really strong. Speaking up to here, Goto Masayoshi suddenly turned his face and looked outside the projection screen. "That lady, please wait." Ryoso Okuhira spoke for the first time. "Mr. Goto, this is the technical director of our factory." Chapter 864. The veteran held a Nyogue's rib and placed it in front of him, observing the curve of the bone after deep processing. The laser ruler of the auxiliary instrument drew one node after another on the surface of the pale yellow bone, and marked the errors down to the micron. As usual, he patrolled the workshop and acted as a quality inspector, spot-checking at any time. His standards were strict, almost harsh. "This one is useless." Since it was useless, the veteran was no longer careful. He held the end of the Nyogue's rib with one hand and felt that it was quite comfortable. He exerted strength in his wrist and used the rib as a pointer, whipping the workbench. "Last night, because of your crude skills, I almost lost my face in front of Mr. Mo. His design, his process, all he needs is your skills. If you can't even do this well, even if you have the face to accept work, I don't have the face to send myself there." Around him, the workshop workers were relatively stable. Most of them kept their mouths shut and kept quiet. No one said anything. However, the overall environment of the workshop was still relatively noisy. At this time, at least 5 times the normal number of people were arranged in the assembly workshop. More than half of the 100-strong laborers of the Hingduan's 7 divisions were stuffed here. The other half were next door. As for the remaining old, weak, women and children, they had another place to settle. In short, it was separated from both sides, giving people more room for imagination, but also breeding more uneasiness. They couldn't help but worry. The current situation was almost exactly the same as the so-called return of the vagrants and then being packed up and sent to Band City. Their fate was still in the hands of others, and they didn't even know whether they would live or die in the future. In the past 10 years, they had suffered 2 similar incidents in a row. Anyone's mentality would collapse. But the more it was like this, the more the veteran had to hold on. He was the spiritual leader of this group of people. Anyone could panic, but he couldn't. He couldn't let everyone waste their energy in the quagmire of negative emotions. Therefore, he secretly clenched his teeth and put up a front. He put on a posture of not panicking in the face of danger, and everything was under control. He worked hard to let the younger generation around him come into contact with more familiar scenes and avoid the imagination combination of negative emotions. At present, the effect was limited, but he still had to bite the bullet and do it. He reprimanded his apprentices with vigor. Everyone in this workshop, go back to your workstations. Those who are not involved, move aside. Today, no matter what, 20 sets of rough materials must be delivered to me. You can't even do this kind of rough work. Why should they praise you? Perhaps it was because his words had given them some room for imagination. Someone asked, "Teacher, that Mr. M.O. Can you help us deal with this?" Old Hand's eyes widened. What is it? What business do we have? A group of people has already come to this point, what more do you want to do? As he spoke, he unceremoniously whipped his little disciple's shoulder with the rib whip, causing the young man's neck to twist and cry out in pain. The veteran maintained his vigorous voice and pointed at the stupid disciple who had rashly stuck out his head and scolded, "We, a bunch of people, have traveled from the Hingduan Mountains to this damned place. We have been exiled for more than 3,000 miles, haven't we? Did the Star Alliance Committee give a reason?" No. No reason is the biggest reason. With this reason, any crime is no longer a reason. As long as the momentum was strong enough, even if the logic was twisted, it would still have the effect of stimulating the brain. The more the veteran spoke, the more confident he became. As long as you don't kill people, commit arson, rob, control your lower body, and don't do those outrageous things, what are you afraid of some groundless crime? Our identity is just a stick in the hands of others, helping to beat the gongs and drums to create momentum. We just need to be stained with mud and bear some crime. We don't need to worry about lice, so what the hell is there to be afraid of? Teacher is right, stop hitting, stop hitting. The talkative disciple's neck was about to twist, but his pleas for mercy were much louder. Old Hand knew when to stop. In fact, he knew very well that these words were extreme and biased, but it was what the group of vagrant children around him were most willing to listen to. This group of young people had already gotten used to using similar methods to hypnotize and numb themselves. They were used to lying at the bottom of the sinkhole and looking up. They had already fallen to this point, so they were not afraid of falling even more. On the contrary, as long as they climbed up a little bit, it would be a great progress. The words were old-fashioned, as long as it worked. The stagnant air in the workshop finally flowed again. The people in the workshop began to move to their respective workstations, while the others stood on both sides against the walls. Seeing this situation, the veteran secretly breathed a sigh of relief. But before he could completely exhale, the side door leading to the observation passage opened, and someone staggered in. It seemed that he had been pushed, and the door behind him immediately closed. Everyone in the workshop looked in that direction. The person who was pushed in was wearing a light blue shirt and jeans, with small white shoes on her feet. She had short hair and a round face, and was dressed in plain clothes. At first glance, she looked quite scholarly, but her age was a little unclear. At this time, she was still quite calm. She just slightly tidied her collar and smiled at the dozens of people in the workshop. In her usual restraint, there was also some bitterness. Then many people shouted at the same time. Director Jiang. Jiang Zhong, why are you here? You're the one who caused all this. You're also locked in here. There were only dozens of people, but they had two different tones when they opened their mouths. Some were concerned, some were sarcastic, especially when they heard the different tones of the people next to them. They even glared at each other. The atmosphere in the entire workshop was no longer stagnant, but it was more chaotic than before. Why are you so noisy? Don't you think it's embarrassing enough? The veteran forcefully swung the pointer, forcefully suppressing the crowd, and at the same time, he separated the crowd and went over there. In fact, he was a little surprised. Jiang Zhong, the technical director of the day's processing factory, the leader of Songping Laboratory, and also their closest collaborator during this period of time, appeared in front of him. Looking at his posture, it was clear that he was also locked in here. The situation was worse than they had expected. At this time, the veteran felt something. He turned his head and looked through the observation window on the outer wall of the workshop, just in time to see a few figures appear over there. Among them were Heir and Rong San, but the most conspicuous one was the drug addict, who had previously ordered the arrest. At this moment, the thoughts in the veteran's mind changed again and again. Finally, he temporarily changed his route and strode to the observation window. The rib pointer directly hit it, and the glass window buzzed. Heir and Rong San, the business can't be done, and you still want to use underhanded methods. What are you planning by getting involved with this union's parasite? If it wasn't for the glass window blocking, the rib pointer would have directly hit Heir and Rong San's face. In fact, the veteran wanted to hit the drug addict next to him. But he didn't dare, he really didn't dare. Heir and Rong San weren't soft-hearted, but at least they were reasonable and operated the factory according to the rules. But the drug addict next to him was willing to do anything. The veteran called him the Union Worm because he was the vice president of the Ping Trade Market Labor Union. This was the most inconspicuous title among more than 10 big and small titles. Even this didn't bring him a good reputation. The veteran also dared to call him a worm because of his identity as a union member. His heart was a little nervous, but if he didn't do this, how could he shift the focus? Goto Masayoshi didn't have any reaction to the veteran's rebuke. His skinny face maintained a faint smile. He didn't say anything and directly turned around to leave. His temper was unbelievably good. Heir and Rong San also left. No matter what, make them today. If you can't make them, then you are not worthy of being the men of Hingduan Mountain. Such a scene, such words were extremely absurd, but it was this absurdity that made the hot-blooded young and strong men stunned. At this moment, the veteran struggled with all his might, but it was not to break free from the restraint. Instead, he exploded with brute force and forcefully brought 2 or 3 men beside him out of the door and into the observation passage. Right here, on the side of the thick wall that could not be seen from the workshop, dozens of armed people with electric batons and anti-riot guns were already ready to go. At the end of the observation passage, Okairu Rongzo and Goto Masayoshi both stood there. Okairu Rongzo, you despicable person, you dare to use a gun. The veteran's eyes were about to pop, and his throat was already hoarse from shouting, not only to the manipulator behind the scenes, but also to the hot-blooded young people in the workshop. The uproar in the workshop somewhat stagnated. At the other end of the passage, Okairu Rongzo was expressionless, but in his heart, he clearly knew who the veteran's burst of hatred was directed at. What a ruthless and experienced person. Goto Masayoshi praised at the side, then turned into the disinfection passage leading to the exit. Okairu Rongzo looked at the veteran again from afar, and followed behind. After a few steps, he finally could not help but say, Mr. Goto, you can withdraw your people. That's fine, maybe there are still people who can't think things through. It looked like Goto Masayoshi had made up his mind to explode a bomb for fun. Okairu Rongzo even wanted to bring out the boldness of the Vanguard captain back then, and smash a fist into the back of this guy's head, but in the end he still clenched his teeth and endured, and followed up, Mr. Goto Shou is a vagrant, even if his faith is chaotic and out of line, it is still pardonable. As for Director Jiang, she is a high-level talent we hired, and usually only buries herself in research. Goto Masayoshi suddenly stopped, turned around, and wiped away the light and shadows of the passage on his face. Mr. Okairu, as far as I know, President Matsudaira has always been famous for being good at management. There is no one in Osaka who doesn't admire his way of management. But here, the daily management is really worrying, especially the human resources. Don't forget, I am the Vice President of the Labor Union, and a Director of the Labor Safety Inspectors Association. I have the responsibility, and also the obligation, to inquire about this matter with your side, and report the results of the inquiry to the relevant parties. So, I hope you can give me a satisfactory answer, and not this kind of meaningless argument. Okairu Rongzo took a deep breath. Mr. Goto, I am introducing the situation to you. Goto Masayoshi raised his hand to cut him off. I said, a hasty answer is not sincere. If you always have this kind of attitude, I can only interpret it as, you are trying to shirk responsibility. Even if Okairu Rongzo was a clay figurine, right now he was also provoked. His majestic body leaned forward. Mr. Goto, what on earth did you see? Can you interpret it as you first chose the frame, and then let me fill in something inside? Please pay attention. Compared to Okairu Rongzo, who was twice as big as him, Goto Masayoshi's expression didn't change. He only raised his hand again, and this time he extended his index and middle finger, turned his wrist, and pointed at his eyes. Mr. Okairu, you cannot trust me, but you have to trust my eyes. Goto Masayoshi's eyes were probably the most prominent part of his thin face. They were a bit bigger than normal people, especially on his face that was so thin it was out of shape, bulging and protruding. Even if he kept his eyelids half closed, the details of the movements of his eyeballs and his eye sockets could be clearly seen. Right now, the dim yellow pupils under his half-covered eyelids were turning, at first glance dim, but in the deepest depths, there was a dark red light. It was like the sunset at dusk, separating the horizon from the night sky. At some point, Okairu Rongzo actually felt a bit dizzy. He subconsciously averted his gaze, unwilling to meet it. Goto Masayoshi's voice pierced his ears. Remember, it won't make a mistake, the only one who will be wrong is you. You're tuning into the Journey of the Soul YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.